The gray plastic bucket weighed exactly 32 pounds when full, a number Sarah Thorne knew because she had spent the last 15 years calculating the weight of things. Ballistics, fuel loads, the heavy silence of a grieving mother in Olween, Iowa. And now, the exact volume of industrial-grade pine sol needed to strip the grease off the floor of Hangar 4 at Fort Hira. She moved the mop in a rhythmic, figure-8 motion, her shoulders locked in a practiced slump that hid the lean, corded muscle of a woman who had spent 3 tours in the Hindu Kush. To the mechanics and the pilots of the 412th Test Wing, she was just Private Thorne, a 24-year-old recruit with a blank stare, and a disciplinary record that explained why she was currently scrubbing the footprints of better men off the epoxy floor. They didn't see the way her eyes tracked the hydraulic fluid leaks on the X-99 prototype, nor did they notice that she was the only person in the room who realized the hangar's ventilation system was cycling 3% slower than the technical manual required. She was a ghost in a tan utility uniform, a shadow with a bucket, and for 6 days, she had been the most invisible person in the state of Nevada. The heat in the hangar was a physical weight, a dry, pressing force that smelled of JP-8 jet fuel and scorched sagebrush. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched in every direction, a landscape of cracked earth and Joshua trees that seemed to be waiting for something to die. Inside, the X-99, Vulture, sat like a predator made of carbon fiber and secrets. It was a billion-dollar drone, the crown jewel of the Air Force's next-generation surveillance program, and it was the reason Sarah was currently wringing out a mop until her knuckles turned white. She grew up in a town where the most important thing you could be was reliable. Olween was a place of cornfields and quiet porches, where her father had worked 30 years at the John Deere plant, and her mother had taught 3rd grade until her hands shook too much to hold a piece of chalk. Sarah had joined the Army on her 18th birthday, not for a sense of adventure, but because she understood the architecture of duty. She liked the way a rifle felt when it was cleaned properly. She liked the way a map told a story that didn't involve feelings. She was a woman of systems, of gears and grids, and she had risen through the ranks of intelligence with a speed that unnerved her peers. By 34, she was a lieutenant colonel, a gray ghost within the Pentagon's oversight office, the person they sent in when a project was bleeding money or lives, and the official reports were lying about why. But here, under the harsh LED lights of Hangar 4, she was nothing. She was the new recruit who had been recycled from basic training for an attitude problem. A cover story so thin it would have vanished under any real scrutiny, but no one ever scrutinizes the person cleaning the toilets. "Hey, Cinderella, you missed a spot near the landing gear." The voice belonged to Specialist Miller, a 20-year-old kid from Ohio who wore his cap at a rakish angle and thought the world owed him a favor for being able to turn a wrench. He was leaning against a tool chest, a smear of grease on his cheek, watching Sarah with the casual cruelty of someone who had finally found someone lower on the food chain than himself. Sarah didn't look up. She didn't let the anger reach her eyes. She kept her gaze on the floor, on the shimmering reflection of the Vulture's underbelly. "Yes, Specialist," she said, her voice a flat Midwestern monotone. It was a voice she had practiced in front of a mirror for 3 weeks, stripping away the authority, the cadence of command, leaving only the dull compliance of someone who had given up. "And make sure you hit the offices after this," Miller added, tossing a crumpled soda can toward her bucket. It missed, clattering across the floor and leaving a sticky trail of Diet Cola. "The Colonel's got a bug up his ass about the dust. Says it's interfering with the sensors, like a little Nevada sand ever stopped a drone from killing a guy 3 miles away." Sarah stopped the mop. She looked at the can. She didn't pick it up immediately. She waited for exactly 3 seconds, the length of time it takes for a superior to feel the first prickle of defiance, and then she bent down and retrieved it. "The Colonel is very thorough," Sarah said. Miller snorted. "Colonel Vance, he's thorough about his career, maybe. He wants that star, Thorne. He wants it so bad he can taste it. This flight test on Friday, that's his golden ticket. If the Vulture flies the way the contractors say it will, he's headed to the Pentagon. If it doesn't, he's probably headed to a desk in North Dakota. So yeah, keep the floors shiny. Maybe it'll distract him from the fact that the engine sounds like a lawnmower with a throat infection." Miller turned and walked away, his boots echoing in the vast space. Sarah didn't follow him with her eyes. She focused on the soda can in her hand. She felt the thin aluminum yield under her thumb. Asterisk, the engine sounds like a lawnmower with a throat infection. Asterisk, she knew what Miller didn't. She knew the Vulture wasn't just a drone. It was a flying sensor suite capable of intercepting encrypted frequencies from 60,000 feet. But more importantly, she knew the throat infection Miller had joked about. For 3 nights, while the base slept and the desert wind howled against the corrugated metal of the barracks, Sarah had stayed awake, listening. She possessed a gift she never spoke of, something that didn't appear on her OMF. She had a near-perfect sense of acoustic resonance. She could hear the difference between a bolt that was torqued to 50 pounds and one torqued to 55. She could hear the micro-fractures in a turbine blade before the sensors even registered a vibration. It was a talent that had made her a nightmare for contractors back in D.C. And it was the reason she was here, mopping floors. The Pentagon had received a series of anonymous, red-file memos suggesting that the X-99 program was being falsified. Test data was being scrubbed. Safety protocols were being bypassed, and the man at the center of it was Colonel Marcus Vance. But Vance was a hero, a West Point grad with a chest full of medals and friends in the Senate. You didn't investigate Marcus Vance with a subpoena. You investigated him with a mop. Sarah moved her bucket toward the landing gear, the very spot Miller had pointed out. As she worked, she leaned her head closer to the fuselage. The hangar was never truly silent. There was the hum of the power units, the whine of the cooling systems, the distant clank of metal on metal. But underneath it all, Sarah listened for the Vulture's heartbeat. The prototype was currently undergoing a low-power diagnostics run. Most people just heard a steady electrical drone. Sarah heard the grit, asterisk click, whir, thrum, asterisk there it was, a secondary harmonic buried deep within the fuel pump assembly. It was a tiny, rhythmic skipping, like a heartbeat missing every 100th beat. To an untrained ear, it was nothing. To Sarah, it was the sound of a catastrophic failure waiting for an altitude of 10,000 feet. It was the sound of a metallurgical flaw in the high-pressure fuel line, the kind of flaw that occurs when you use cheaper, non-spec alloys to save money and meet a deadline. She stood up slowly, her back aching from the deliberate slouch. She looked around the hangar. No one was watching. The mechanics were gathered around a computer terminal at the far end, arguing over a data set. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from the sleek, dark skin of the drone. She didn't touch it. Touching it would be a violation of her persona. Recruits don't touch the billion-dollar toys, but she felt the vibration in the air, the subtle tremolo of a machine that was being forced to lie about its own health. "Private Thorne!" The voice was like a whip crack. Sarah flinched, a genuine physical reaction to the suddenness of it, and pulled her hand back. She turned to see Colonel Marcus Vance standing in the doorway of the hangar office. He was a tall man, built like a middleweight boxer, with silvering hair at his temples and a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He wore his flight suit with the effortless grace of a man who knew he looked good in it. Behind him stood his executive officer, a jittery major named Holloway who looked like he hadn't slept since the Vulture arrived at Fort Hira. Sarah dropped her gaze, her posture returning to that of a defeated recruit. "Yes, Colonel." Vance walked toward her, his boots clicking with a terrifying precision on the very floor she had just cleaned. He didn't stop until he was in her personal space, the scent of expensive aftershave and stale coffee hitting her like a wall. He looked down at her, his eyes scanning her face with a mixture of boredom and irritation. "Why are you standing there staring at my aircraft, Private?" Vance asked. His voice was a rich, practiced baritone, the kind used for giving speeches at military balls. I was looking at the grease, sir," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. This was the controlled part of her performance. She didn't beg. She just played the part of someone who was intimidated by power. "The specialist told me to make sure the landing gear was clean. I was trying to see where the leak was coming from." Vance glanced at the landing gear, then back at Sarah. He didn't see a lieutenant colonel who had once briefed the Joint Chiefs. He saw a nuisance. A problem child he had been forced to take on as a favor to some training commander at Fort Benning. "There is no leak, Private," Vance said coldly. "That aircraft is the most advanced piece of machinery in the United States arsenal. It does not leak. What it does is win wars, and it can't do that if its hangar is being managed by someone who spends 10 minutes staring at a strut." "I'm sorry, sir," Sarah said, staring at his boots. There was a smudge of Nevada dust on the left toe. She felt a surge of quiet, icy rage. He was so sure of himself, so certain that he was the smartest person in the room because of the silver eagles on his shoulders. Major Holloway, Vance said, not taking his eyes off Sarah. Yes, Colonel, the XO stammered. Ensure the sergeant in charge of the detail knows that Private Thorne is to be given extra duty tonight. The latrines in Barracks B are a disgrace. If she likes looking at filth so much, let's give her plenty of it to occupy her time. Understood, sir, Holloway said, scribbling on a clipboard. Vance stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. Listen to me, Thorne. You're here because you couldn't cut it in the real army. You're here because you have a problem with authority. But in my house, authority is the only thing that keeps the desert from swallowing us whole. You will mop this floor, you will scrub those toilets, and you will stay out of the way of the men who are actually doing something for this country. Do I make myself clear? Crystal, sir, Sarah said. Vance held her gaze for a second longer, searching for a spark of defiance. Sarah gave him nothing. She kept her eyes blank, her face a mask of dull compliance. Finally, he turned on his heel, his XO trailing after him like a nervous shadow. As they walked away, Sarah heard Vance's voice carry back to her. God, Holloway, why do they keep sending me their garbage? We have a test flight in 48 hours, and I'm spending my time disciplining a girl who can't even handle a mop. Sarah stood still until the office door slammed shut. The rage was there, but it was a cold thing, a tool she used to sharpen her focus. She looked down at the floor. Vance had walked right through the wet pine sol, his heavy tread leaving a trail of dull, muddy prints across the pristine surface. She didn't sigh. She didn't curse. She simply dipped the mop back into the gray water and began to erase his footsteps one by one. The cost of being right, Sarah knew, was often silence. If she had spoken up as a lieutenant colonel, they would have called her a troublemaker or emotionally compromised. By coming here as a private, she had surrendered her voice entirely. But in return, she had gained the ability to see the world as it actually was, not as the brass wanted it to appear. 4 hours later, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, turning the Nevada sky a bruised purple. Sarah was in the latrines of Barracks B, the smell of bleach stinging her nostrils. She was alone. The recruits who lived here were out on a night march, their distant shouts echoing across the base. She was scrubbing the grout behind a row of toilets when her partner arrived. He didn't make a sound. He just appeared in the doorway, a tall, thin man in civilian clothes, faded jeans, and a Carhartt jacket that looked like it had seen better decades. His name was Elias Thorne, though they weren't related. He was a retired master sergeant, a former CAG operator who now worked for the same gray department Sarah did. To the base, he was just a local contractor who handled the HVAC systems. "You look like hell, Sarah," Elias said, leaning against the doorframe. He was chewing on a toothpick, his eyes sharp and watchful. Sarah didn't stop scrubbing. "Vance gave me extra duty. I'm a disgrace, apparently." "He's a peacock," Elias said. "Peacocks don't like it when the ground looks back at them. Did you get close to the bird?" "I heard it, Elias," Sarah said, finally dropping the brush and sitting back on her heels. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of bleach-scented soap. "The fuel pump resonance is off. It's the high-pressure line. They're using the 400 series alloy instead of the 600. It's lighter, cheaper, and it can't handle the vibration at high RPMs. Elias frowned. "The specs called for 600. That's a class of violation." "Vance is under pressure to bring the Vulture in under budget and ahead of schedule," Sarah said. "The 600 series alloy has a 6-month lead time right now because of the supply chain issues. The 400 series is sitting in warehouses in Vegas." He made a call. He probably told himself it was close enough. "Friday's flight test is a high-altitude endurance run," Elias said, his voice turning grim. "If that line blows at 60,000 feet, the fuel will vaporize instantly. The whole bird becomes a Roman candle." "I know," Sarah said. "We have enough to pull the plug?" Sarah shook her head. "No, not yet. All I have is an acoustic signature. Vance will say I'm a disgruntled recruit with an overactive imagination. He'll say the diagnostic computers didn't flag it, and he'll be right, because he's the one who programmed the computers to ignore that specific frequency. I need physical proof. I need the procurement logs or the original metallurgy report." Elias looked at her, his eyes softening for a brief moment. He was the only person in the world who saw her clearly. He had been with her in the Ganjgal Valley when she had stayed behind to coordinate the extraction of a stranded ranger platoon, her voice calm and steady on the radio even as the mortars turned the ground around her into a lunar landscape. He knew what she was capable of, and he knew what it cost her to be here scrubbing toilets for a man like Marcus Vance. "I can get into the server room in Building 3 tomorrow," Elias said, but the procurement logs are on a closed loop in Vance's personal office. You'd have to get in there physically. I'm the dirt squad, remember? Sarah said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. I'm supposed to clean his office tomorrow at 0500. It's risky, Sarah. If he catches you on his terminal. He won't, she said, picking up the brush again. To him, I'm just part of the furniture. People don't worry about the furniture watching them. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. Just remember what happened in Billings, Sarah. You tried to save everyone then, too. Sarah's hand hesitated for a fraction of a second. The memory of Billings, the fire, the screams, the way the smoke had tasted like burnt plastic, was always there, just below the surface. She had been a young captain then, and she had tried to pull a man out of a burning Humvee. She had succeeded, but she had lost 2 fingers on her left hand and a piece of her soul in the process. The man had died 3 days later anyway. I'm not trying to save everyone, Elias, she said, her voice hard. I'm trying to save the mission. Right, Elias said softly. The mission. He turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway as quickly as he had appeared. Sarah went back to work. She scrubbed until her hands were raw, until the smell of bleach was the only thing she could feel, until the world narrowed down to the space between 2 tiles. The next morning, the base was blanketed in a thick, low-hanging fog, a rarity for the desert. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Sarah was at the door of the administrative building at exactly 0455, her cleaning cart rattling with the sound of spray bottles and plastic bags. The MP at the desk, a bored-looking corporal named Reeves, barely glanced at her ID. You're late, Thorne. The cart had a flat tire, Corporal, Sarah lied. Reeves waved her through. Just get it done. The colonel is in a mood today. The brass from D.C. are arriving at noon. Sarah pushed her cart down the quiet, fluorescent-lit hallway. The air here was different from the hangar. It was cold, sterile, and smelled of ozone and carpet cleaner. She passed several offices where the lights were already on, the sounds of keyboards and hushed conversations drifting through the doors. But the executive wing was silent. She reached Colonel Vance's office and paused. She took a breath, centering herself. This was the moment where the dark competence had to take over. She wasn't a recruit anymore. She was a hunter. She pushed the cart into the office and locked the door behind her. The room was exactly what she expected. Thick mahogany desk. Framed photos of Vance shaking hands with presidents and generals, a display case filled with challenge coins. It was a temple to his own ego. Sarah didn't waste time. She moved to the desk, her eyes scanning the surface. There was a stack of folders, a secure laptop, and a small, leather-bound notebook. She didn't touch the laptop yet. The internal sensors would log her biometrics the moment she touched the keys. She began to clean. She sprayed the desk with polish, her movements wide and practiced. As she wiped the surface, she tilted the folders just enough to see the labels. *X99 flight schedule. Logistics Phase 4. Personnel reviews. *nothing. She moved to the filing cabinet in the corner. It was locked with a standard-issue biometric scanner. Sarah reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out a small, gray device the size of a deck of cards. It was a thermal imaging scanner she had borrowed from Elias's toolkit. She held it over the keypad. The heat signatures from Vance's fingers were still there, faint but visible. He had entered his code recently. The numbers glowed in a sequence, 8 to 4 to 1 to 9. *8419. The year Vance had graduated from West Point and the day of his birth. Predictable, she entered the code. The cabinet clicked open. Sarah worked with a surgical precision. She flipped through the files, her mind recording the information like a high-speed camera. Invoices from Titan Metallurgical. Shipping manifests from the North Las Vegas depot. She found it at the bottom of the 3rd drawer. A single red-bordered folder labeled Internal Quality Assurance, Sensitive. She opened it and felt the air leave her lungs. It was all there. The original report from the lead engineer, a woman named Dr. Thorne, no relation, a common name, but a strange coincidence. Dr. Thorne had warned Vance 6 weeks ago that the fuel lines were substandard. She had documented 3 separate bench test failures, and at the bottom of the report, in Vance's bold, arrogant handwriting, was a single note. Schedule is the priority. Proceed with Phase 2. Thorne reassigned to Eglin AFB effective immediately. He hadn't just ignored the warning. He had buried the person who gave it. Sarah reached into her pocket for her phone to photograph the document, but before her hand could even touch the fabric, she heard a sound that made her blood turn to ice. The sound of a key turning in the lock. She didn't panic. Panic was for people who didn't have a plan. In less than 2 seconds, she had closed the folder, slid it back into the cabinet, shut the drawer, and was standing by the window with a bottle of glass cleaner in her hand. The door swung open and Colonel Vance walked in. He wasn't alone. Major Holloway was with him, along with a man Sarah didn't recognize, a civilian in a tailored suit who looked like he belonged on Wall Street, not a desert airbase. Vance stopped when he saw her. His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing in here, Private?" Sarah didn't turn around immediately. She finished the stroke she was making on the glass, then turned with a look of mild surprise. "Cleaning the windows, sir. The corporal told me to start with the executive offices." Vance looked at the desk, then at the filing cabinet. He was a suspicious man by nature, a man who survived by assuming everyone was out to get him. "I didn't authorize anyone to be in my office this morning." "I'm sorry, sir," Sarah said, her voice small. "I can leave." "No," the civilian said, stepping forward. He was looking at Sarah with a strange intensity. "Let her finish. I like a clean workspace." Vance hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but be quick about it, Thorne. We have business." Vance and the civilian sat down at the conference table at the far end of the office. Holloway stood by the door, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Sarah continued to clean the windows, her ears straining to catch every word. "The investors are nervous, Marcus," the civilian said. His voice was smooth like oil. "The rumors about the fuel system have reached the board. They want reassurances before the flight on Friday." "The rumors are just that, Julian," Vance said, his voice firm. "Disgruntled employees who couldn't handle the pace of a high-priority program. The Vulture is ready. I've personally reviewed the data." "And the bench tests?" Julian asked. "I heard there were discrepancies." "The bench tests were conducted under unrealistic conditions," Vance said. "We've adjusted the parameters. Friday will prove that. We're going to push it to Mach 2 at 60,000 feet. When the Air Force sees those numbers, the contract will be signed by Monday." "And if it fails?" Vance leaned forward, his face inches from the civilians. "It won't fail. I've put my entire career on this bird. Do you think I'd do that if I weren't sure?" "I think you're a man who knows how to win, Marcus," Julian said. "But I also know that winning sometimes requires shortcuts." "There are no shortcuts," Vance said, though Sarah could hear the lie in his voice. It was a hollow sound, like a cracked bell. "Only optimizations." Sarah moved her cleaning cloth in a slow, steady circle. Asterisk optimizations. Asterisk, that was what they called it when they decided lives were less important than stock prices. She was about to move toward her cart when she saw something on the floor near Vance's feet. It was a small, white scrap of paper. It must have fallen out of the folder when she was closing it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If Vance saw it, if he realized someone had been in that folder, she was done. Not just her cover, but the entire investigation. She had to get it. She moved across the room, her eyes fixed on the trash can near the desk. "I'll just empty the bin, sir, and then I'll be out of your hair." She walked toward the desk, her heart racing. Vance and Julian were still locked in their conversation, their voices rising as they debated the finer points of the contract. She reached the trash can and bent down. The scrap of paper was just inches away. It was a corner of the metallurgy report with the words asterisk class a failure asterisk clearly visible. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the carpet. "Wait." It was the civilian Julian. He was looking at her again. Sarah froze. She didn't pick up the paper. She didn't even look at it. She stayed bent over the trash can, her hand resting on the rim. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, looking up at him. Julian walked over to her. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and right now he wanted to know why the janitor was so focused on a piece of trash. "You have very steady hands for a recruit, Private," Julian said. He reached down and picked up the scrap of paper before Sarah could. He looked at it. He didn't react. He just held it between two fingers, his eyes flicking from the paper to Sarah's face. "What is this?" he asked, turning to Vance. Vance stood up, his face turning a shade of pale that Sarah had only seen on the dead. He walked over and snatched the paper from Julian's hand. He looked at it for a long second, and then he looked at Sarah. The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant roar of a jet engine on the runway, the sound of her own breath. "Where did this come from, Thorne?" Vance asked. His voice was no longer a baritone, it was a hiss. I don't know, sir," Sarah said, her voice trembling. This wasn't an act anymore. The fear was real, but it wasn't fear for herself. It was the fear of being right about the worst possible thing. "It was just on the floor. I was going to throw it away." Vance stepped closer, his presence looming over her. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip like a vise. "You were in my files." "No, sir, I was just cleaning." "Marcus, calm down," Julian said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. She's a plant, Vance said, his eyes wild. I knew there was something off about her. No recruit is this quiet. No recruit stays this invisible. He turned to Holloway. Call security. Now, I want this girl in a holding cell. I want to know who she's talking to, who she's working for, and what she thinks she found. Holloway reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the building was rocked by a massive explosion. The windows shattered, raining glass onto the carpet. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the red glow of the emergency strobes. The sound was a physical blow, a concussive force that threw Sarah to the floor and sent Vance stumbling back against his desk. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her training taking over. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at the civilian. She ran to the window. Outside the hangar she had just left was a wall of orange flame. The roof of Hangar 4 had been torn open like a tin can, and a thick plume of black smoke was billowing into the Nevada sky. The Vulture. It hadn't waited for Friday. The low-power diagnostic run, the harmonic resonance, the 400 series alloy, it had failed right there on the hangar floor. Sarah looked back at Vance. He was staring out the window, his face a mask of horror. He knew exactly what had happened. The fuel lines, Sarah said. Her voice wasn't flat anymore. It wasn't the voice of a recruit. It was the voice of a lieutenant colonel, cold and sharp as a bayonet. Vance turned to look at her, his eyes widening as he heard the change in her tone. What did you say? Sarah stepped over the debris, her eyes locked on his. She didn't care about her cover anymore. She didn't care about the mission. People were dying in that hangar, men like Miller, who was probably still leaning against that tool chest when the line blew. I said the fuel lines failed, Marcus, she said, her voice echoing in the ruined office. Just like Dr. Thorne said they would, just like I told you they would. Vance reached for his sidearm, his hand shaking. Who the hell are you? Sarah didn't flinch. She stood her ground, the red light of the emergency strobes dancing in her eyes. I'm the person who's going to make sure you never wear those eagles again, she said. But before Vance could respond, the radio on Holloway's belt crackled to life. All units, this is Hangar 4. We have multiple casualties. The fire is spreading to the ordnance lockers. We have a live fire situation. Repeat, the ordnance lockers are at risk. Sarah's heart stopped. The ordnance lockers. Hangar 4 didn't just house the Vulture. It housed the Hellfire missiles and the precision-guided bombs that were supposed to be loaded onto the drone for the endurance test. If the fire reached those lockers, the entire base would be leveled. She looked at Vance. He was frozen. The hero was gone, replaced by a man who was drowning in the consequences of his own ego. Sarah didn't wait for him. She turned and ran for the door. Thorne, get back here, Vance shouted, but she was already gone. She sprinted down the hallway, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning electronics. She passed MPs running in the opposite direction, their faces etched with panic. She didn't stop until she reached the main entrance. Elias was there, waiting by his truck. He had a radio in one hand and a medical kit in the other. He didn't ask what happened, he just looked at her and knew. The ordnance, Elias, Sarah said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. If the fire hits the lockers, this whole place goes up. I know, Elias said. The fire crews can't get close. The heat is too intense. I can get close, Sarah said. Sarah, no, that's a suicide mission. It's the only mission we have left, she said. She looked toward the burning hangar. She could see the silhouettes of people trapped inside, their shadows dancing against the flames. She thought of Miller. She thought of her father in Olween. She thought of the code she had lived by since she was 18 years old. She wasn't a recruit. She wasn't a lieutenant colonel. She was the only person in the desert who knew how to stop the ticking clock. She turned to Elias. Give me the keys to the truck. Sarah. Give me the keys, Elias. That's an order. Elias hesitated for a heartbeat, his eyes searching hers. Then he reached into his pocket and pressed the keys into her hand. Don't die for that man, Sarah, he whispered. I'm not dying for him, she said. I'm dying for them. She jumped into the truck and slammed it into gear. As she sped toward the inferno, she saw the silhouette of Colonel Vance standing on the balcony of the administrative building, watching her go. He looked small. He looked defeated. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The heat was already beginning to blister the paint on the hood. The sound of the fire was a roar, a hungry, living thing that wanted everything she had left. She drove straight into the smoke, the world turning black and orange, her mind narrowing down to a single, impossible task. She had been mopping floors for a week. But as she steered the truck toward the heart of the explosion, Sarah Thorne knew that the cleaning was only just beginning. The heat outside the truck's cabin transformed the Nevada air into a shimmering, distorted veil that tasted of burnt magnesium and vaporized hydraulic fluid. Sarah shifted the Ford F-150 into fourth, the engine screaming as she bypassed the primary emergency lane, which was already choked with white and blue-based security vehicles and a single, struggling Oshkosh fire truck. The windshield wipers on the Ford began to curl and blacken against the glass, the rubber succumbing to the radiant heat before she was even within 50 yards of the structure. Through the haze, Hangar 4 looked like a dying star, a core of blinding white light surrounded by a swirling nebula of black JP-8 smoke. She didn't slow down for the perimeter fence. She rammed the gate, the chain link screeching as it tore away from the posts and skidded to a halt near the secondary hydrant. The moment she opened the door, the sound hit her, a roar so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. It wasn't just the sound of fire, it was the sound of a billion-dollar dream tearing itself apart. "Thorne, get back!" The shout came from a master sergeant she recognized from the motor pool, a man named Grier who was currently trying to drag a hose toward a position that was already untenable. He didn't see a lieutenant colonel. He saw a private who had lost her mind. Sarah ignored him. She reached into the back of Elias's truck and pulled out a heavy-duty Nomex flight jacket and a pair of blackened goggles. She moved with a terrifying economy of motion precision that made Grier freeze. The way she checked the seal on her gloves, the way she scanned the structural integrity of the hangar's north wall, it wasn't the behavior of a recruit. It was the behavior of an incident commander. "Master Sergeant!" Sarah's voice cut through the roar of the inferno, projecting with a diaphragm-driven authority that she hadn't used in months. The automated suppression system is offline because the primary sensors were calibrated for the X-99's low-emission profile. They didn't trigger because the initial flash was too fast. You're trying to fight a Class D fire with water. You hit that magnesium casing with that hose and you'll level this entire block. Grier blinked, his hands tightening on the brass nozzle. "Who the hell are you?" "The person telling you how to stay alive," Sarah said, stepping into his space. She didn't have time for the reveal, but she had even less time for his incompetence. "The ordnance lockers are behind the Bravo 6 partition. The fire is currently eating through the carbon fiber fuselage. In 6 minutes the heat will reach the Hellfire propellant. If those cook off, the blast radius takes out the barracks and the fuel farm." She didn't wait for his permission. She turned to the truck as Elias pulled up in a second vehicle, a beat-up Chevy utility van. He hopped out before it had even fully stopped, carrying a thermal imager and a heavy breaching tool. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. This was the rhythm they had forged 5 years ago in a basement in Arlington and perfected 2 years later in a dust-choked valley outside Kandahar. Elias knew the look in her eyes. It was the gray ghost look, the total surrender of self to the requirements of the objective. "The back door is still clear of the primary collapse," Elias said, his voice a low growl against the chaos. He handed her a handheld radio tuned to a private frequency. "But the ceiling joists are screaming, Sarah. You've got maybe 10 minutes before the whole roof comes down. I'll stay on the hydrant and try to keep the partition cool from the outside. You go in, you find the manual override for the Halon dump." "Miller is still in there," Sarah said, looking at the jagged hole where the main hangar doors had been. Elias looked at the flames, then back at her. He didn't tell her it was too late. He didn't tell her Miller wasn't worth it. He just checked the oxygen tank on his own back and nodded once. "I'll watch the sensors. If I see a spike in the propellant temp, I'm calling you out. And you're coming out, Sarah. No Billings heroics." "Copy," she said. She turned and ran toward the back of the hangar, her boots hitting the scorching asphalt with a rhythmic thud. The air was a thick, poisonous soup that burned her throat, but she didn't slow down. She reached the service door, kicked it open, and was immediately swallowed by the gray-black throat of the building. Inside, the world was a nightmare of orange light and falling debris. The vulture, or what was left of it, was a skeletal ruin in the center of the floor, its wings drooping like melted wax. The sound of the secondary explosions, smaller fuel cells and electrical components, was like a string of heavy firecrackers going off in a cathedral. Sarah stayed low, her goggles fogging instantly. She used the wall as a guide, moving toward the office where Miller had been leaning just an hour ago. Every few seconds, a piece of the ceiling would drop, a rain of molten plastic and metal that hissed as it hit the floor. "Miller!" she screamed, her voice sounding thin and fragile against the roar. Nothing. She pushed forward, passing the scorched remains of a tool chest. The heat was so intense now that she could feel the hair on her arms singeing through the flight jacket. She reached the partition, the thick, reinforced wall that separated the maintenance floor from the ordnance storage. It was hot to the touch, the paint already bubbling and peeling away in long, charred strips. She found him 3 meters from the locker door. Miller was pinned under a fallen support beam, his legs trapped beneath a twisted mass of steel. His face was covered in soot, his eyes wide and vacant with shock. He was clutching a wrench like a talisman, his knuckles white. "Private," Miller whispered as she knelt beside him. His voice was a wet, rattling sound. "Thorne, is that you?" "I've got you, specialist," Sarah said. She didn't waste time on comfort. She examined the beam. It was a 400-pound section of I-beam. She couldn't lift it alone, not with her leverage. The bird, Miller wheezed, a string of bloody saliva trailing from his lip. It just went. I was checking the line, like you said. I heard the skip. Then the world turned red. "Shut up and breathe, Miller," Sarah commanded. She looked around. A forklift sat 10 feet away, its tires melted, but its hydraulic mass still looked intact. She stood up, but a sudden tremor in the floor sent her back to her knees. A massive section of the hangar roof collapsed 50 feet away, sending a plume of sparks and debris into the air. The fire was no longer just a fire. It was a hungry entity closing in on the ordnance lockers with every second. "Elias," she keyed the radio. "I've got Miller, northeast corner, pinned by a beam. I need you to bypass the exterior halon lines. The interior manual pull is melted." There was a long silence filled only with the crackle of static. Then Elias's voice came through, strained and tight. "Sarah, listen to me. I just got a look at the telemetry from the fire chief's terminal. The primary fuel manifold didn't just leak. It was sabotaged, Sarah. The safety valves were manually overridden from the control room. This wasn't an accident, and Vance just ordered the fire crews to pull back. He's calling it a total loss. He's going to let the hangar blow." Sarah felt a surge of icy, crystalline rage. Vance wasn't just incompetent, he was a murderer. He was going to let Miller and anyone else in the building die to ensure that the evidence of his shortcuts was vaporized in a massive, convenient explosion. If the hangar leveled, there would be no fuel line to inspect, no metallurgy report to find. There would just be a tragedy and a hero's funeral for a drone that failed under testing. "He's not blowing this hangar, Elias," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal intent. "Tell the fire chief to hold his position. Tell him I'm an officer of the United States Air Force and I'm taking command of this scene under Emergency Protocol 10-2. "He won't believe me, Sarah. You're a private on paper." "Then make him believe you," she snapped. She turned back to Miller. She didn't have the forklift. She didn't have a crew. She had a wrench, a beam, and a man who was dying. She grabbed a long steel pry bar from the floor and wedged it under the beam. She threw her entire weight onto it, her muscles screaming as she tried to find the leverage. "Come on," she hissed through gritted teeth. "Move, you son of a bitch." The beam groaned, shifting a fraction of an inch. Miller screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut off by a cough of blood. Again, Sarah whispered to herself. She heaved again, her vision blurring with the effort. This was the cost. This was the weight of being right. If she had stayed in D.C., if she had fought this with memos and meetings, Miller would be safe in Ohio right now. Because she had chosen the gray ghost path, she was the only thing standing between him and an unmarked grave in the Nevada sand. Slowly, agonizingly, the beam lifted. Miller scrambled backward, dragging his crushed legs across the epoxy. He collapsed against the partition wall, gasping for air. Sarah dropped the pry bar, her hands shaking. She didn't have time to check his injuries. She turned to the partition wall. On the other side were the Hellfires, 12 of them, each one capable of turning this entire wing of the base into a crater. She reached for the manual halon pull, but as Elias had predicted, the plastic housing had melted into a useless lump of slag. She keyed the radio again. "Elias, I'm at the partition. The manual pull is gone. I'm going to have to bypass the solenoid manually. I need you to get to the server room. Now." "The server room is in the admin building, Sarah. Vance is there." "I don't care if the president is there," Sarah said. "The halon system is controlled by a legacy PLC in the basement of Building 3. If you can bridge the 24-volt line, it'll trigger the dump regardless of what the software says. You have 4 minutes, Elias. If you don't do it, Miller and I are going to be a very expensive smear on the horizon." "On my way," Elias said. Sarah sat back on her heels, looking at Miller. He was looking at her, his eyes clear for the first time. "You're not a private," he whispered. "No," Sarah said, her voice soft. "I'm not. Why are you here?" "Because people like Marcus Vance think they can trade lives for stars," she said. "And I'm the person who reminds them that the math doesn't work that way." Outside, the administrative building was a hive of controlled panic. Colonel Vance stood in the center of the command center, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of grim determination. Major Holloway was beside him, clutching a phone like it was a life preserver. "The fire crews are clear?" Vance asked. "Yes, sir," Holloway said. "The chief wasn't happy, but I told him the risk of a secondary explosion was too high. He's established a 500-yard perimeter." "Good," Vance said. He looked at the monitors, which showed a grainy, heat-distorted view of Hangar 4. In his mind, he was already writing the report. Despite the heroic efforts of the ground crew, a catastrophic failure of the experimental propulsion system led to a total loss of the prototype. Specialist Miller is missing and presumed dead. It was a clean story. It was a story that led to a promotion and a quiet retirement. "Sir," Holloway said, his voice trembling, "the contractor, the HVAC guy Elias Thorne, he just forced his way into the basement of Building 3. The MPs are trying to stop him, but he's armed, sir." Vance's head snapped around. Armed with what? "A breaching tool and a sidearm. He told the guards he was under orders from a superior officer to trigger the Halon dump." Vance's eyes narrowed. "A superior officer? What officer?" "He didn't say, sir. He just said the ghost is inside." Vance felt a cold prickle of dread at the base of his spine. The ghost. It was a name he had heard whispered in the corridors of the Pentagon. A legend. A woman who didn't exist, who moved through the military's blackest projects like a scalpel, cutting out corruption before it could spread. He had always dismissed it as a myth, a campfire story for disgruntled colonels. "Get down there," Vance said, his voice low and dangerous. "Take a security detail. If he tries to touch that PLC, you use whatever force is necessary to stop him. He's a civilian intruder on a high-security military installation during a national security crisis. Do you understand me, Major?" Holloway swallowed hard. He looked at the silver eagles on Vance's shoulders, then at the fire on the screen. He saw the flicker of something in Vance's eyes, not leadership but a desperate, cornered animal. "Yes, sir," Holloway said. In the basement of Building 3, Elias Thorne was currently sweating through his Carhartt jacket. He had the electrical panel open, a forest of wires and relays staring back at him. He was a master of many things, but high-voltage PLC logic was a specialized field he hadn't touched since the 90s. "Come on, Sarah," he muttered, his fingers hovering over a set of blue terminals. "Give me something easy." The door to the basement kicked open. "Drop the tool, hands in the air." Elias didn't look back. He knew the sound of an M4 carbine being readied. He kept his eyes on the wires. "Major Holloway, I assume you might want to tell your boys to lower the toys. I'm trying to save your base." "You're trespassing, mister." "Thorne," Holloway said, his voice cracking. He was standing at the top of the stairs, flanked by two young MPs who looked like they were seconds away from pulling their triggers. "Step away from the panel." "I can't do that, Major," Elias said, finally finding the 24-volt bridge. "Because if I do, Colonel Thorne dies, and if she dies, this whole base becomes a historical footnote." "Colonel Thorne?" Holloway whispered. "There is no Colonel Thorne at Fort Hira." "That's the point, kid," Elias said, his voice turning cold. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Holloway's. "She's been scrubbing your floors for a week, watching you and Vance play God with a drone that was built with stolen steel and lies. She's in that hangar right now with a kid named Miller who's bleeding out because Vance wanted to meet a deadline. Now you can let me flip this switch, or you can explain to a congressional oversight committee why you murdered a lieutenant colonel to protect a man who doesn't even know your middle name." Holloway froze. The room was silent, save for the hum of the building's generators. The two MPs looked at each other, their weapons dipping slightly. "Major," one of the MPs asked, "what do we do?" Holloway looked at the panel, then at Elias. He thought about the way Vance had looked at the fire, the cold, calculating eyes of a man who saw lives as data points. Then he thought about the private who had been cleaning the toilets, the woman who had taken a mop to the floor with more dignity than Vance had ever shown in a flight suit. "Is she really in there?" Holloway asked. "She's in there," Elias said, "and she's not coming out until that fire is dead." Holloway took a breath. It was the loudest sound in the room. "Do it," he said. "Major," the other MP protested. "I said do it." Holloway roared, "Step back, that's an order." Elias didn't wait. He jammed the wire into the terminal. Inside Hangar 4, the world changed in an instant. There was a sound like a giant's intake of breath, a massive, pressurized asterisk whoosh asterisk as the Halon tanks in the ceiling triggered. A thick white fog began to pour from the vents, cascading down like a silent waterfall. The fire didn't die immediately. It fought, the flames turning a strange, sickly green as the chemical gas stripped the oxygen from the air. Sarah grabbed Miller by the collar and dragged him into the smallest, most airtight corner of the ordnance locker. She pulled her flight jacket over both their heads, creating a small pocket of breathable air. "Hold your breath, Miller," she hissed. "Hold it until your lungs scream." The halon was cold, bitterly, impossibly cold. It surged through the hangar, snuffing out the inferno with a ruthless efficiency. The roar of the fire was replaced by a high-pitched whistling, the sound of the gas equalizing in the vast space. Sarah felt the consciousness slipping from her. The heat, the smoke, the effort of lifting the beam, it was all catching up to her. She leaned her head against the cool metal of the locker, her hand still gripped firmly on Miller's shoulder. Asterisk, I did it. Asterisk, she thought. Asterisk, the mission is still alive. Asterisk, but as the white fog began to clear, Sarah heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the settling of the building or the hiss of the gas. It was the sound of a pistol being cocked. She opened her eyes, her vision swimming. The halon had cleared enough for her to see the silhouette of a man standing in the wreckage of the hangar doors. He was wearing a flight suit. He was holding a Beretta M9, Colonel Marcus Vance. He was alone. He had realized that Holloway had failed him, and he had come to finish the job himself. He looked like a ghost in the white mist, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Sarah," Vance said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the hangar. "You should have just kept mopping." Sarah didn't move. She didn't have the strength to stand, let alone fight. She looked at Miller, who was unconscious, his head lolling against her chest. "It's over, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice a raspy whisper. "The halon triggered, the base knows. Elias is at the PLC. Holloway isn't going to cover for you anymore." "Holloway is a coward," Vance said, stepping over a piece of charred fuselage. "And Elias Thorne is a dead man. I've already called in a security breach to the main gate. By the time anyone figures out what happened here, you'll be just another casualty of the explosion, a tragic accident, a hero's death for a private who tried to save a specialist." "You'd kill your own people," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing, "just to save a career that's already dead." "My career isn't dead," Vance said, his voice rising. "This program is the future of the Air Force. It's bigger than you, bigger than me, and certainly bigger than some kid from Ohio. I'm doing what's necessary, Sarah. That's what leaders do. We make the hard choices." He raised the Beretta, the barrel pointing directly at Sarah's forehead. "You're not a leader, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice steady and cold. "You're just a man who's afraid of the dark, and I'm the darkness you've been running from your whole life." Vance's finger tightened on the trigger. Asterisk crack. Asterisk the sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Sarah flinched, waiting for the impact, the cold bloom of lead. But it didn't come. She opened her eyes and saw Vance stumbling back, his hand clutching his shoulder. A crimson stain was already spreading across his flight suit. She turned her head and saw Elias standing in the service doorway, his own sidearm raised, his face a mask of iron. He hadn't waited for the MPs. He had come for her. "Drop it, Colonel," Elias said, his voice flat and final, "or the next one goes through your eye." Vance looked at Elias, then at Sarah, then at the smoking ruin of the Vulture. He looked like he wanted to scream, to rage against the world that had finally caught up to him. But instead he just slumped against a blackened support beam, the Beretta clattering to the floor. Elias ran to Sarah, kneeling beside her. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was barely audible. "Get Miller, he needs a medevac, now." "The ambulances are at the perimeter," Elias said. "Holloway is bringing them in." He turned Sarah. "He gave up the codes. It's over." Sarah leaned her head back, the adrenaline finally leaving her system. She felt the weight of the last 15 years, the weight of every secret she had kept, every lie she had told, every person she hadn't been able to save. She looked up at the hole in the roof where the first stars were beginning to peek through the smoke. "No," she whispered. "It's not over. It's just starting." 3 hours later, the base was a sea of flashing lights and moving shadows. The fire was out, replaced by a cold, wet smell that clung to everything. Sarah was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, a shock blanket wrapped around her shoulders. A medic was cleaning a cut on her forehead, but she didn't feel it. She watched as the MPs led Colonel Vance away in handcuffs. He didn't look like a hero anymore. He looked like a small, broken man in a dirty flight suit. Major Holloway was standing nearby, talking to a group of men in dark suits who had arrived on a Gulfstream 5 minutes ago. The men from D.C. had finally arrived, but they were too late to do anything but count the bodies. Elias walked over, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand. He handed it to her, his eyes searching her face. "Miller's in surgery," he said. "The doctors say he'll lose a leg, but he'll live. He's already asking for the girl with the mop." Sarah managed a small, tired smile. "He's a good kid. He deserves better than this place." "We all do," Elias said. He sat down beside her, the two of them looking out at the ruined hangar. "What happens now, Sarah? The D.C. crew is already asking questions. They found the files in Vance's office. They know you were undercover. They'll try to bury it," Sarah said, her voice turning hard again. "They'll say it was a rogue officer and a brave recruit. They'll try to keep the Vulture program alive because there's too much money tied up in it. And you?" Sarah looked at the silver eagles on the epaulets of the man who was currently briefing the D.C. crew. She thought about her office at the Pentagon, the quiet, air-conditioned world of gray ghost oversight. She thought about the way the mop had felt in her hands, the way the floor had looked when it was clean. "I'm not going back, Elias," she said. "Sarah, you've got a career, you've got a path to a star." "The path to a star is paved with people like Miller," she said. She stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She looked at the ruined hangar, the skeletal remains of the billion-dollar drone. "I'm done with the shadows. I'm done with the gray ghost. If I'm going to fight this, I'm going to do it in the light." She turned and began to walk toward the admin building, her stride long and purposeful. "Where are you going?" Elias called after her. Sarah didn't look back. "I'm going to have a conversation with those men in suits, and then I'm going to find out who else was on that board Julian mentioned." She reached the group of officials and stopped. They looked at her, a soot-covered woman in a torn flight jacket, her face a map of exhaustion and rage. They saw a private. "Excuse me, young lady," one of the men said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a restricted area. You need to return to your barracks." Sarah didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, laminated card, her real ID, the one she hadn't used in months. She held it up, the holographic seal of the Department of Defense gleaming in the emergency lights. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thorne," she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying across the quiet base like a tolling bell. "And I'm the person who's going to tell you exactly how you're going to explain this to the American people." The men in suits froze. Holloway looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. But before Sarah could speak again, a low, rhythmic thumping sound began to echo from the desert. It wasn't a helicopter. It was a fleet of them, black, unmarked Hueys flying low and fast, their lights off. Sarah looked toward the horizon, her stomach dropping. She knew that silhouette. She knew that flight pattern. "Elias!" she shouted, but it was too late. The first of the helicopters touched down on the tarmac, and a team of men in tactical gear, not MPs, not Air Force, but something else entirely, spilled out. They didn't move toward the fire. They didn't move toward the injured. They moved toward the administrative building, and they were carrying thermite charges. Sarah realized with a sickening jolt that Vance wasn't the top of the pyramid. He was just a middle manager, and the people who actually owned the Vulture were here to make sure that the cleanup was final. She looked at Elias, who had already drawn his weapon. She looked at Holloway, who looked like he was about to faint. Into the truck, Sarah commanded, her voice a whip-crack of authority. "Now, Sarah, what about the files?" Elias asked. "The files don't matter if we're dead," she shouted. She grabbed Holloway by the arm and shoved him toward Elias's van. As they scrambled inside, the first of the thermite charges detonated in the server room of Building 3, a blinding white flash that illuminated the desert for miles. The institutional failure was no longer quiet. It was explosive. Sarah slammed the van into gear, her eyes fixed on the main gate. She could see more headlights approaching from the highway, a convoy of black subs. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a target. And as she drove toward the desert, the sounds of the base dying behind her, Sarah Thorne knew that the real war hadn't even started yet. The van cleared the perimeter fence just as a second explosion rocked the admin building, sending a mushroom cloud of white-hot debris into the night sky. Sarah didn't look back. She kept her foot on the gas, the steering wheel vibrating in her hands. "Where are we going?" Holloway whimpered from the back seat. Sarah looked at the rearview mirror, watching the lights of Fort Hira fade into the darkness. "We're going to find Dr. Aris Thorne," Sarah said, her voice cold and steady, "and then we're going to burn it all down." But as they hit the main highway, a single high-pitched tone began to emanate from the van's radio. It was a frequency Sarah recognized, the same secondary harmonic she had heard in the drone's engine. It wasn't a diagnostic signal. It was a tracker, and it was coming from inside the van. Sarah looked at the dashboard, then at Holloway, then at the dark, empty road ahead. The trap hadn't just been set, it had already been sprung. "Elias," Sarah whispered, her hand moving toward the door handle. "Get out." "What? Get out now." She slammed on the brakes, the van skidding sideways across the asphalt. But before the tires could even stop smoking, a beam of blue light, narrow, intense, and terrifyingly precise, descended from the clouds. It was the Vulture. The *2 prototype. The one nobody knew existed. And it was locked on their position. Sarah looked up through the windshield, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She just gripped the wheel and waited for the world to end. The light intensified, the air around the van beginning to hum with a lethal electrical energy. Sarah Thorne, the woman who had spent her life calculating the weight of things, finally knew the weight of the truth. It was heavy enough to crush them all. The glass of the Chevy's side view mirror didn't just shatter when the blue beam touched it. It turned into a fine, crystalline dust that Sarah could feel against her cheek like a spray of frozen needles. She didn't scream, and she didn't slam on the brakes, because she knew that the dwell time on a high-energy liquid laser system like the one currently painting her vehicle was exactly 0.8 seconds between the ranging pulse and the terminal strike. She jerked the steering wheel hard to the left, sending the van into a violent, sliding skid toward the shoulder of Highway 375. The desert floor here was a graveyard of ancient volcanic rock and thirsty creosote bushes, and as the tires left the asphalt, the world became a chaotic symphony of rattling metal and the smell of pulverized sagebrush. "Out! Get out now!" Sarah's voice wasn't a shout. It was a command that bypassed the ears and landed directly in the nervous systems of Elias and Major Holloway. The van hadn't even come to a full stop when she kicked her door open. Behind them, the second Vulture prototype, a machine that existed only in the classified annexes of the Air Force Research Lab, banked silently in the thin Nevada air. It didn't have a roaring jet engine. It utilized a series of plasma-actuated fans that made a sound like a distant, rhythmic sigh. But that sigh was the last thing many people would ever hear. Sarah grabbed Holloway by the scruff of his flight suit and threw him into a shallow drainage ditch, her body shielding him as the second beam found the van. There was no explosion, not at first. There was only a terrifyingly bright white light and a sound like a giant piece of silk being torn in half. The Chevy's engine block was vaporized in an instant, the remaining fuel in the lines igniting in a secondary, localized bloom of orange flame that looked pathetic and primitive compared to the blue, clinical precision of the laser. "Move," Sarah hissed, her hand finding the grip of her M17 sidearm. She didn't look back at the burning van. She looked up. In the pale light of the rising moon, the Vulture 2 was a ghost. It was finished in a Vanta-black coating that seemed to drink the stars, leaving only a jagged, moving hole in the sky. To anyone else, it was a terrifying, invincible god of the air. To Sarah Thorne, it was a sequence of code and a set of engineering compromises. She had been the one to write the tactical vulnerability assessment for the original Vulture project 3 years ago, a document that Vance had buried under a mountain of NDA agreements and national security redlining. She knew the machine's eye was located in a gimbal beneath the nose, and she knew that the sensor fusion software had a specific latency when tracking multiple targets in high-clutter environments. "Elias," the ditch. "Stay in the shadow of the rocks," she ordered. Elias was already moving, his Carhartt jacket blending into the shadows. He was trailing blood from a jagged cut on his arm where a piece of the van's window had caught him, but he didn't make a sound. He was a professional, and he knew that Sarah was operating in a headspace he hadn't seen since the gray ghost ops in the Hindu Kush. This was her extraordinary capability, not just combat skill, but a form of tactical synthesis that allowed her to see the world as a series of interlocking systems. She wasn't just looking at a drone. She was looking at a mathematical problem that required a lethal solution. "They're coming," Holloway whimpered, his face pressed into the dirt. "Vance wasn't alone. Those helicopters, those weren't ours." "They are ours, Major," Sarah said, her voice cold and flat as she scanned the horizon. "They just don't belong to the Air Force. They belong to the people who funded the Vulture's second iteration, private military contractors, likely Aegis or a Tier 1 offshoot. They're here to sanitize the site." The smell of the desert changed. The scent of dry earth was replaced by the sharp, acrid odor of ozone and the heavy, sweet smell of JP-8 fuel. 2 miles away, the Black Hueys were landing, their rotors kicking up a massive cloud of alkali dust that shimmered in the moonlight. They were deploying the erasers, contractors who operated in the gray spaces between the law and the mission. Sarah felt the weight of the night pressing down on her. She had a wounded partner, a terrified major who was a walking liability, and a stealth drone circling her like a hungry shark. Her hidden capability, the one that had made her a legend in the black-budget world, began to hum in the back of her mind. It was a sensory processing speed that felt like time was slowing down. She could see the vulture's flight path, predicting its next bank. She could hear the distinct frequency of the eraser's tactical radios. "Elias," she said, her voice a low vibration. "I need your breaching tool and the tablet Holloway was carrying." "The tablet's fried, Sarah," Elias said, sliding toward her in the dirt. "The screen is fried," she corrected, her fingers already working on the back of Holloway's flight suit to find the encrypted data pad he'd been clutching. "The solid-state drive is hardened. I need the EM burst from the tool's ignition coil to create a momentary signal spike. I'm going to give the vulture something else to look at." She took the breaching tool, a high-powered hydraulic spreader, and the cracked tablet. With a precision that would have looked impossible to a witness, she began to strip the wires from the tablet's charging port. Her hands were steady, even as the Vulture 2 completed its turn and leveled its nose back toward the ditch. She wasn't guessing, she was calculating. The drone's sensor array used a specific LiDAR pulse to confirm target lock. If she could mimic the return frequency of a human heart rate using the spreader's electrical pulse, she could draw the laser away from them for just long enough. "On my mark," Sarah whispered. "You run for the ridge. Don't look back, don't stop for anything. If you hear the laser, hit the ground and stay there." "What about you?" Holloway asked, his voice trembling. "I'm the bait," Sarah said. She stood up. It was a movement of pure, terrifying confidence. She didn't crouch, she didn't hide. She walked out of the ditch and onto the open flats of the desert, holding the breaching tool and the tablet like a strange, tech-heavy offering to the sky. The Vulture 2 saw her instantly. The blue ranging pulse hit her chest, a cold flicker of light that felt like a ghostly finger touching her heart. Sarah didn't flinch. She watched the drone, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. She triggered the breaching tool. A massive arc of blue-white electricity jumped between the spreader's teeth, and at the same moment she smashed the tablet against a rock, forcing the battery to short-circuit. The resulting electromagnetic bloom was a neon sign in the drone's infrared and LiDAR spectrum. To the Vulture's software, it looked like a catastrophic power surge from a high-value target. The drone's logic looped. It hesitated. "Run!" Sarah roared. Elias and Holloway bolted toward the dark silhouette of the ridge. Sarah stayed where she was, her feet planted in the sand, her eyes locked on the black shape in the sky. She could feel the air around her begin to vibrate, the atmosphere ionizing as the laser prepared to fire. This was the cost of being right. This was the weight of every secret she had carried. She was one woman standing in a desert, challenging a billion-dollar mistake. The laser fired. Sarah dived to her right, her body moving with a fluid, explosive grace that felt like it belonged to a younger woman. The beam hit the spot where she had been standing half a second before, turning the sand into a 3-foot-wide pool of molten glass. The heat was so intense it singed the back of her flight jacket, the smell of burning Nomex filling her lungs. She rolled, came up on one knee and fired 3 rounds from her M17. She wasn't trying to down the drone, she was aiming for the sensor gimbal. The 9mm rounds sparked against the armored casing, but the impact was enough to rattle the delicate mirrors inside the laser's guidance system. The blue light flickered, then died. The Vulture 2 banked away, its software struggling to recalibrate after the physical shock and the EM interference. Sarah didn't wait to see if it would return. She ran. The desert was a blur of shadows and sharp edges. Her lungs burned, the dry air feeling like sandpaper in her throat. She found Elias and Holloway at the base of the ridge, tucked into a narrow crevice between 2 massive boulders. "Is it down?" Holloway gasped. "No," Sarah said, her voice a raspy growl. "It's just blind for a minute, but the erasers are on the move. They've got thermal imaging and night vision. We need to reach the old mining tunnels on the north side of the ridge. If we can get underground, the Vulture can't find us." I can't make it," Holloway said, his face pale in the moonlight. "I'm a major, I'm not a ranger, I'm not. Whatever you are." Sarah grabbed him by the front of his suit, her eyes inches from his. "You are exactly what you need to be to survive the next 20 minutes, Major. You are a man who knows the access codes for the Vulture's master override. You are the only living witness to Marcus Vance's treason. And you are going to walk up that hill because if you don't, I will leave you here to explain your failures to the men with the thermite charges. Do you understand?" Holloway swallowed hard and nodded. They began to climb. The ridge was a vertical nightmare of loose shale and sharp-edged granite. Every step cost them. Sarah could hear Elias's ragged breathing behind her, the sound of a man who was pushing past the limits of his endurance. She reached back, her hand finding his belt, helping him over the ledge without a word. They were a team of 3, but only one of them was still operational at a high level. The Gray Ghost wasn't just a nickname, it was a state of being. Sarah felt herself retreating into that cold, quiet place where pain was just data and fear was just an obstacle to be managed. She could see the heat signatures of the pursuit team now, 400 yards back. They were moving in a tactical diamond formation, their movements professional and precise. They weren't rushing, they knew they had the advantage. "They're closing," Elias whispered, his hand on his sidearm. "Let them," Sarah said. "The tunnels are just ahead." They reached the entrance to the abandoned silver mine, a jagged hole in the rock that looked like a screaming mouth. The air coming out of it was cold and smelled of damp earth and ancient rot. Sarah pushed Holloway inside, then Elias. She stayed at the entrance for a moment, looking back at the desert. The Vulture 2 was back, its sensor light sweeping the ridge like the eye of a vengeful god. The Black Hueys were hovering nearby, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. The world was hunting her. Sarah stepped into the darkness of the tunnel, the silence swallowing her whole. Inside, the mine was a labyrinth of rotting timbers and rusted tracks. They moved by touch, their hands brushing against the cold, damp walls. Sarah led the way, her internal compass guiding her toward the deep shafts that led further into the mountain. "We need a moment," Elias said, his voice echoing in the darkness. He slumped against a wall, his legs giving out. Sarah knelt beside him. She pulled a small flashlight from her pocket, shielding the lens with her fingers so only a thin sliver of light escaped. Elias's arm was a mess. The blood was dark and thick, soaking through his sleeve. "You're losing too much, Elias," she said, her voice soft for the first time. "I've had worse," he lied, his teeth chattering. "In the valley, remember, the IED that took out the Humvee?" "I remember," she said. She took a roll of medical tape and a clean rag from her kit and began to bind the wound. Her hands were gentle but firm. "I remember I had to carry you 3 miles to the LZ. "You did," Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. "And I never thanked you for that." "You thanked me by staying in the service when everyone else quit," Sarah said. She finished the bandage and looked at him. "Can you move? For you, always." They stood up, but the moment was interrupted by a low, metallic clanging sound from the entrance of the mine. "They are inside," Holloway whispered. Sarah turned off the light. The silence of the mine was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against their eardrums. Then she heard it, the faint, rhythmic click of a tactical boot on a rail. Then another. They were being hunted by professionals who didn't need light to see. "Stay here," Sarah commanded. "Sarah, no," Elias said, reaching for her arm. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "I'm just going to change the terms of the engagement." She moved back toward the entrance, her boots making no sound on the dirt floor. She didn't use her gun. In the close quarters of the mine, muzzle flash would be a death sentence. She pulled a combat knife from her boot, the blackened blade invisible in the dark. She could feel the air pressure change as the first eraser entered the main chamber. He was using a PVS-31 night vision system, the green glow of the tubes invisible to the naked eye but a beacon to Sarah's trained senses. She didn't move. She became part of the wall, her breathing so shallow it wouldn't have fluttered a candle flame. The eraser passed her, his M4 held at the ready. He was good, but he was looking for a target, not a part of the environment. Sarah moved. It was a single blurring motion. She stepped behind him, her left hand coming over his mouth to stifle any sound, her right hand driving the knife into the gap between his helmet and his tactical vest. There was a sharp, wet sound, a brief struggle, and then silence. She lowered the body to the ground with a grace that was almost reverent, her eyes already searching for the next target. She found the second eraser 10 feet behind the first. He had seen his partner disappear, and he was already raising his weapon. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw the knife. It was a move of pure desperation, a 1-in-a-million shot that she had practiced thousands of times in the basement of the Pentagon. The blade buried itself in the man's throat, his finger jerking on the trigger of his M4. The sound of the gunshot was a physical blow in the enclosed space. It echoed through the tunnels, a thunderous roar that would alert every other hunter on the ridge. Sarah didn't wait. She grabbed the dead man's M4 and a flashbang from his vest. "Elias, Holloway, move!" she screamed. They ran deeper into the mine, the sound of shouting voices and more gunshots following them. The erasers were no longer being quiet. They were flooding the tunnels, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like sabers. "There's a vertical shaft," Holloway shouted, pointing toward a rusted iron ladder that disappeared into the floor. "It leads to the lower levels. My grandfather worked this mine. He told me about the drainage tunnels that lead to the valley floor." "Go," Sarah said. She stood at the top of the shaft, the M4 braced against her shoulder. The first group of erasers rounded the corner, their lights blinding. Sarah didn't look at the lights. She looked at the shadows. She fired in short, controlled bursts, the muzzle flash illuminating the tunnel in strobe-like flickers. She saw the men fall, heard their cries of pain, but she felt nothing. She was a machine now, a weapon designed for this specific moment of maximum pressure. She was the one woman who had seen the truth, and she was going to make sure that truth survived the night. "Sarah, come on!" Elias's voice came from the bottom of the shaft. She dropped a flashbang into the tunnel, the white light and the concussive roar giving her the 3 seconds she needed. She grabbed the ladder and slid down, the iron burning her palms. She hit the bottom with a jarring thud and kept moving. They were in the drainage tunnels now, the water ankle-deep and freezing cold. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and old wet stone. They moved as fast as they could, the sound of their splashing footsteps echoing like drums. "We're almost there," Holloway said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "The exit should be just around this bend." They turned the corner and stopped. The exit wasn't a jagged hole in the rock. It was a massive, reinforced steel door bolted shut from the outside. And standing in front of it was a man Sarah recognized. Major Holloway's face went white. "General Miller?" General Raymond Miller was the man who had overseen the Vulture Project from its inception. He was a hero of the Gulf War, a man with 3 stars on his shoulders, and a reputation for integrity that was legendary in the Pentagon. And he was standing in a drainage tunnel in the middle of the Nevada desert, holding a SIG Sauer with the casual ease of a man who had used one many times. "Lieutenant Colonel Thorne," Miller said, his voice echoing in the tunnel. "I must say your performance over the last 72 hours has been nothing short of extraordinary, the gray ghost indeed." Sarah stepped forward, her M4 lowered but ready. "General, I assume you're here to congratulate me on exposing Marcus Vance's corruption." Miller laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Marcus was a fool, Sarah. He was a necessary fool, but a fool nonetheless. He thought he was the architect of this project. He didn't realize he was just the foundation. The Vulture isn't about a drone, Sarah. It's about the integration of autonomous lethal decision-making into the national security infrastructure. It's the future. And the future doesn't have room for people like you who still believe in oversight and accountability." "You're killing your own people, General," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal intent. "Specialist Miller, your own namesake, is lying in a hospital bed with his legs blown off because you wanted to meet a testing deadline." "The price of progress is always paid in blood, Sarah," Miller said, his eyes narrowing. "You know that better than anyone. How many men did you lose in the valley? How many lives did you trade for the intelligence that kept the Pentagon safe for another year? You're not a saint, you're a pragmatist. And as a pragmatist, you should understand that you can't win this." "I don't need to win," Sarah said. "I just need to survive." "You won't," Miller said. He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the entire tunnel shook with a massive, earth-shaking explosion. The steel door behind him was blown off its hinges, a wall of fire and debris rushing into the tunnel. Sarah dived for the floor, her hands over her head. The shockwave was like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She felt the cold water wash over her, the taste of mud and cordite filling her mouth. When she opened her eyes, the tunnel was a nightmare of smoke and flickering orange light. General Miller was gone, buried under a pile of rubble. The steel door was a twisted wreck, and standing in the opening, framed by the moonlight and the smoke, was a man she didn't expect to see, Master Sergeant Grier. He was holding a LAW rocket launcher, the tube still smoking. He looked at Sarah, then at Elias and Holloway. "Lieutenant Colonel Thorne?" Grier asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Master Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she stood up. "Specialist Miller sent me," Grier said, a grim smile on his face. He told me that if I wanted to find the person who saved his life, I should look for the woman who knew more about the base than the commander. I figured a LAW rocket would be the best way to open the door. Sarah looked at him, the weight of the moment finally hitting her. Grier wasn't part of the gray ghost world. He wasn't a man from D.C. or a contractor with a tactical vest. He was a soldier, a man who understood loyalty because he lived it every day. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," Sarah said. "Don't thank me yet," Grier said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The Vulture is still up there, and those black helicopters are coming back. We need to get to the motor pool. I've got a striker fueled up and ready to go." They ran out of the tunnel and into the night air. The desert was alive with sound and light, a chaotic battlefield that stretched for miles. They reached the striker, a massive 8-wheeled armored vehicle that looked like a fortress on wheels. Grier jumped into the driver's seat while Sarah, Elias, and Holloway scrambled into the back. "Hold on!" Grier roared. The striker surged forward, its massive tires tearing through the sand. They were moving at 60 miles an hour, the armored hull vibrating with the power of the engine. Behind them, the Vulture 2 was diving again, its blue laser cutting through the air like a sword. "Sarah, the remote weapon station," Elias shouted, pointing to the joystick and monitor in the back. Sarah grabbed the controls. She had never operated a striker's RWS, but her hidden capability, the ability to see the logic of the machine, kicked in. She saw the targeting reticle, the thermal signature of the Vulture, the lead calculation software. She locked on. "I've got it," she whispered. She pulled the trigger. The .50 caliber machine gun on top of the striker began to roar, a rhythmic asterisk thump 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 asterisk that shook the entire vehicle. The tracers reached out into the night, a line of fire that found the Vulture's wing. The drone faltered, its flight path becoming erratic. Sarah didn't stop. She kept firing, her eyes fixed on the monitor. She saw the Vulture's fuel line ignite, a bloom of white light that illuminated the desert for miles. The drone banked one last time, then spiraled into the ground, a massive explosion marking its end. The silence that followed was deafening. Grier slowed the striker to a stop. They were 5 miles from the base, on a lonely stretch of highway that led toward the mountains. The fire from the Vulture's crash was a distant, dying glow on the horizon. Sarah sat back, her hands shaking. She looked at Elias, who was pale but alive. She looked at Holloway, who was staring at his hands in disbelief. She looked at Grier, who was watching her with a look of profound respect. "It's over," Holloway whispered. "No," Sarah said, her voice a low, steady vibration. "The drone is gone, the general is dead, but the people who funded them, they're still out there. They are in the Pentagon, in the boardrooms, in the halls of Congress." "What are we going to do?" Grier asked. Sarah looked at the ID card in her hand, the one that identified her as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thorne. She thought about the gray ghost and the woman who had spent 15 years in the shadows. "We're going to do what we've always done," she said. "We're going to protect the mission, but this time we're going to do it so everyone can see." She stood up and walked to the back of the striker, looking out at the desert. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, a sliver of gold that promised a new day. They were still standing. They were battered, they were broken, and they were officially outlaws in the eyes of the institution they served. But as Sarah Thorne watched the light spread across the Nevada sand, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The cost had been high. She had lost her career, her anonymity, and a piece of her soul. But she had saved a life, exposed a lie, and found a team of people she could trust with her life. "Master Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice clear and resonant. "Yes, ma'am. Take us to the nearest secure communications facility. I have a report to file, and I think the American people are going to want to hear every word of it." Grier nodded, his hand moving to the gear shift. "Copy that, Colonel. Where to?" Sarah looked toward the mountains, toward the future that was as uncertain as the desert wind. "D.C.," she said. "We're going to the heart of the machine." The striker surged forward, its massive tires leaving deep ruts in the sand. The desert was quiet now, the fire of the night replaced by the cold, clear light of morning. Sarah Thorne sat in the back of the armored vehicle, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a woman who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. And as the miles began to pass, she felt the first flicker of hope, a small, specific thing that was as real as the weight of the rifle in her hand. The war wasn't over, but for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she was fighting for. The striker reached the main highway, its headlights cutting through the early morning fog. They passed a sign that read, "Tonopah 50 miles." Sarah leaned her head against the armored hull, the rhythmic vibration of the engine a soothing sound in the silence. She looked at Elias, who had fallen into a shallow, exhausted sleep. She looked at Holloway, who was watching the sunrise with a look of awe. She looked at Grier, whose steady hands on the wheel were a reminder of the strength of the men and women she had sworn to lead. The institution had failed her. The leaders had betrayed her. The system had tried to erase her. But as she sat in the dark of the striker, Sarah Thorne knew that the institution was not the people. The leaders were not the mission, and the system was only as strong as the people who were willing to challenge it. She closed her eyes, the first rays of the sun warming her face. She was a soldier. She was a leader. She was a woman who had found her voice in the middle of a storm, and she was ready for whatever came next. The striker continued its journey, a lonely shadow moving through the vastness of the Nevada desert. Behind it, the smoke from Hangar 4 was a distant, fading memory. Ahead, the world was waiting, a world that would soon know the name Sarah Thorne and the story of the gray ghost who had decided to step into the light. The immediate aftermath was surreal. They reached a small, remote communications outpost near the edge of the test range, a place that felt like it belonged to another century. The air was cold, the ground covered in a layer of frost that crunched under their boots. Sarah stepped out of the striker, the weight of her gear feeling like a part of her body. She walked toward the small, weather-beaten building, her mind already moving through the next steps of the mission. She didn't look at the sky, she didn't look back. She walked through the door and into the light, her face a map of the last 72 hours. She was still standing. She was still Sarah Thorne. And the reckoning, though it was still a long way off, had already begun. The man behind the counter, a tired-looking civilian contractor, looked up from his coffee. He saw a soot-covered woman in a torn flight jacket, her eyes clear and sharp as a hawk's. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her ID card. She placed it on the counter, the holographic seal catching the light. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thorne," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "And I need a secure line to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right now." The man blinked, his hand frozen on his coffee cup. He looked at the card, then at the woman standing before him. He saw the strength in her eyes, the quiet power in her voice, and he knew that he was looking at someone who had just come back from a war that nobody else knew was happening. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice dropping into a register of respect. "Right this way." Sarah followed him into the back room, her boots clicking on the floor. She sat down at the console, the flickering screens reflecting in her eyes. She felt the weight of the last 15 years, the weight of every secret she had kept, every lie she had told, every person she hadn't been able to save. She picked up the phone, the dial tone a steady, reassuring hum. "This is Colonel Thorne," she said, her voice a clear, ringing bell in the quiet room. "I have a report to make, and I suggest you start recording. This is going to take a while." The sun was fully up now, its light flooding the desert with a golden warmth. Outside, the striker was a silent sentinel against the sky. Elias and Holloway were sitting on the bumper watching the horizon. Grier was lean against the hull, his eyes fixed on the road. They were a small group, a handful of people who had seen the truth and lived to tell it. They were the remnant of a mission that had gone wrong and the beginning of a mission that would change everything. Sarah Thorne sat in the quiet room, her voice steady as she began to tell the story of the Vulture, of Marcus Vance, of General Miller, and of the cost of silence. She told it with a precision that was chilling, a clarity that was undeniable. She told it for the people who couldn't tell it themselves. And as she spoke, she felt the last of the gray ghost slipping away, replaced by the woman she had always been, a woman of integrity, of courage, and of a loyalty that was bigger than any one institution. She was Sarah Thorne, and she was just getting started. The immediate aftermath was over. The crisis had passed, but the true battle, the battle for the soul of the military she loved, was just beginning. And as she finished her report and hung up the phone, Sarah Thorne knew that she was no longer alone. She had a team, she had a mission, and she had a truth that was more powerful than any laser or any drone. She stood up and walked out of the building, the cold air hitting her face. She looked at the men waiting for her, Elias, Holloway, Grier. She saw the look in their eyes, the shared understanding of what they had been through and what they were about to face. "What now?" Elias asked, standing up. Sarah looked at the horizon where the mountains were etched against the clear blue sky. "Now," she said, her voice a soft, steady vibration. "We go home, and we make sure this never happens again." They climbed back into the striker, the armored vehicle surging forward once more. They were moving toward a future that was as uncertain as the desert wind, But as they hit the main highway and began the long journey east, Sarah Thorne felt a sense of peace that was as real as the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had survived the night. She had survived the vulture, and she was ready for the dawn. The clock on the wall of interrogation room 4B at Fort Belvoir skipped a beat every 14 seconds. A mechanical stutter that was the only sound in a space that smelled of lemon-scented floor wax, and the cold, metallic tang of industrial air conditioning. Sarah Thorne sat at the steel table, her back perfectly straight despite the fact that the skin beneath her charcoal gray t-shirt was a map of second-degree burns and raw, weeping blisters. She didn't lean against the chair because the pressure of the plastic would have been an agony she wasn't ready to share with the two men watching her from behind the mirrored glass. She sat with her hands folded, her fingers steady, watching the way the fluorescent light hummed in a frequency that most people would have ignored, but which Sarah felt in the marrow of her bones. It was 0400 hours on a Wednesday, exactly 48 hours since she had walked out of the Nevada desert. And in that time, the United States Army had not once asked her if she was hungry. The door opened with a heavy, pressurized thud. Colonel Marcus Henderson walked in, carrying a thick manila folder labeled with a red, top-secret //psi cover sheet that looked far too thin to contain the wreckage of the last 3 days. Henderson was a man built of sharp angles and career-long compromises, his class a uniform pressed so sharply it looked like it could draw blood. He didn't sit. He threw the folder onto the table and stood over her, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the formica surface. He was the kind of officer who believed that volume was a substitute for authority, but as he looked at Sarah, he found himself lowering his voice, suppressed by the sheer, terrifying stillness of the woman across from him. "You realize, Thorne, that if we follow the letter of the law, you'll never see the sun again without bars in front of it," Henderson said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. "You stole a striker. You engaged a $1 billion DARPA asset with unauthorized munitions. You caused the death of a 3-star general. And you did it all while being technically AWOL from your post at the Pentagon. There are people in the E-ring right now who want to bypass the UCMJ entirely and just drop you into a black site in the Carolinas until you forget your own name." Sarah didn't blink. She watched a small bead of sweat crawl down Henderson's temple, noting the exact speed of its descent. "General Miller was not killed by me, Colonel. He was killed by the failure of his own security protocols, and the Vulture asset was not engaged. It was neutralized after it opened fire on a United States major and a civilian contractor. I believe the JAG Corp calls that self-defense of others, though I'm sure you found a way to redact that part of the report." Henderson leaned down, his face inches from hers. The smell of coffee and high-end bourbon rolled off him. "There is no report, Thorne, not yet. There is only a hole in the desert and a lot of very powerful people trying to figure out how to fill it with your career. You think you're a hero? You're a liability. You're the gray ghost who finally haunted the wrong house. Major Holloway is currently in a psychiatric observation ward at Walter Reed. Elias Thorne, your supposed partner, is being prepped for surgery to remove 3 inches of shrapnel from his humeral artery. And you're sitting here acting like you've still got the high ground." "I don't act, Colonel," Sarah said, her voice like the sound of a knife being drawn across silk. "I observe. And right now I observe a man who is terrified that the paper trail for the Vulture project leads directly to his desk. You didn't come in here to threaten me. You came in here to see if I've already sent the encrypted data to the Senate Armed Services Committee." The silence that followed was a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Henderson's eyes darted toward the mirrored glass for a fraction of a second, a tell so obvious Sarah almost felt sorry for him. She knew then that the room wasn't just being recorded by the OIG. It was being watched by the people who had funded Miller. The institution was grinding, its massive, rusted gears turning in an effort to crush the one person who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The institution of the United States military is a creature of habit, and its most deeply ingrained habit is the preservation of the hierarchy. Within 6 hours, Sarah was moved from the interrogation room to a windowless officer's quarters in a secure wing of the base. It was a room designed to look like a courtesy, but it was a prison. 2 MPs stood outside the door, their faces blank, their rifles held at a low ready. They didn't look her in the eye. To them, she was a ghost story, a legend of the special operations community who had suddenly become a pariah. The personal cost began to arrive in waves during the quiet of the first night. Without the adrenaline of the hunt, Sarah's body started to fail. The burns on her back began to throb with a rhythmic intensity that matched her heartbeat. She stripped off her shirt in the dark, her breath catching in her throat as the fabric tore away from the scabs. In the small, flickering light of the bathroom mirror, she saw the woman who remained. Her skin was sallow, her eyes sunken, the weight she'd lost in the desert making her cheekbones look like glass. She looked at her hands, the hands that had guided a .50 caliber machine gun into the heart of a stealth drone, and saw that they were shaking. It wasn't fear. It was the physical manifestation of a life lived in the margins, now being dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of a formal inquiry. She had spent 15 years being the person the military called when they needed something done that didn't exist on paper. She had been the shadow in the corner of the room, the silent architect of impossible victories. And now, the very people who had used her skills were using the lack of a paper trail to erase her. At 0900 the next morning, a knock came at the door. It wasn't Henderson. It was a woman in a Navy commander's uniform, her hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead. She carried a tray with a plastic cup of water and 2 white pills. "I'm Commander Voss. I'm the staff physician assigned to your transition," the woman said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was clinical, the tone of someone who had seen enough trauma to recognize it as a logistical problem. "Take the ibuprofen, and I need to change your dressings." Sarah sat on the edge of the cot, allowing the woman to work. The smell of antiseptic filled the small room, a sharp, clean scent that made the reality of the desert feel even further away. Voss worked in silence for 10 minutes, her hands efficient as she peeled back the temporary bandages Sarah had fashioned for herself. "You're lucky," Voss said quietly, her back to the door. "Another few hours in that sun and you'd have needed a skin graft. Who treated you in the field?" "I did," Sarah said. "And the man, Elias, the report says you cauterized a bleeder with a heated blade. It was a tactical necessity." Voss stopped, her hand resting for a second on Sarah's shoulder. It was a brief, unauthorized moment of human contact. "They're going to try to break you by telling you he didn't make it. They'll say he's in a coma or that he's blaming you for what happened. Don't believe them. I saw his chart before they locked it down. He's awake. The first thing he asked for wasn't a doctor. It was a lawyer for the colonel." Sarah felt a sharp, localized pang in her chest, not the pain of the burns, but something deeper. Elias, the one man who had seen her clearly when she was nothing but a set of coordinates and a mission profile. He was paying the price for her conviction, sitting in a secure ward at Walter Reed, probably surrounded by the same blank-faced guards that were currently outside her door. The loyalty between them wasn't something that had been discussed. It was something that had been forged in the heat of a dozen different valleys, in the shared silence of 1,000 miles of desert. To the institution, that loyalty was a weakness to be exploited. To Sarah, it was the only thing that kept her from becoming the monster they wanted her to be. "Thank you, Commander," Sarah said. Voss didn't reply. She finished the dressing, packed her kit, and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoing like a gunshot. By Friday, the reckoning for the authority figures began to take a different, more insidious shape. Marcus Vance, the man who had initiated the Vulture Project, was not in a cell. He was in an office at the Pentagon, surrounded by a team of crisis management specialists and a phalanx of JAG officers. Sarah knew this because she could hear the shifts in the base's atmosphere. The frequency of the Black Hueys landing at the helipad increased. The MPs outside her door were replaced by Tier 1 contractors, men with beards and no-name tapes, the erasers who had survived the night in Nevada and were now being integrated back into the official fold. The institution was protecting itself by absorbing the threat. They were going to turn the Vulture disaster into a rogue element story, with Sarah as the lead villain and General Miller as the tragic hero who had died trying to stop her. It was a narrative as old as the military itself, a way to keep the funding flowing while burying the truth in a classified annex. But they had forgotten one thing. Sarah Thorne didn't just know the secrets. She knew the people. On Saturday afternoon, she was taken from her room and driven in a blacked-out SUV to a nondescript office building on the outskirts of Arlington. There were no signs on the building, just a series of high-resolution cameras and a reinforced steel gate. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. She was led into a conference room where 4 men sat behind a mahogany table. They were the Gray Men. the civilian undersecretaries and retired generals who actually ran the black-budget world. In the center sat Arthur Sterling, a man whose career in the intelligence community spanned 4 decades and 5 administrations. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like someone's grandfather with soft blue eyes and a voice that sounded like dry leaves. "Sit down, Sarah," Sterling said. He didn't use her rank. He used her name, a subtle way of reminding her that in this room her rank no longer existed. Sarah sat. She didn't look at the other men. She looked at Sterling. "I assume this is the part where you offer me a comfortable retirement in exchange for my silence." Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're beyond that, I'm afraid. The Vulture project was more than just a drone, Sarah. It was a proof of concept for an autonomous command and control system that would have removed the human hesitation from the kill chain. You didn't just destroy a machine. You set back our national security posture by a decade. There are people in this building who believe that constitutes treason." "I destroyed a machine that was programmed to target American citizens on American soil," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I destroyed a machine that was being used to cover up the embezzlement of $300 million in classified funds. If that's treason, then I'd like to see the definition you're using." One of the other men, a retired Air Force general named Maddox, slammed his hand on the table. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Colonel. You were a tool. A very effective tool, but a tool nonetheless. You were supposed to provide the tactical assessment, not act on it. You went outside the wire. You compromised a Tier 1 operation." "I did the job you were too cowardly to do, General," Sarah said, turning her gaze on him. The intensity in her eyes was so sharp Maddox actually recoiled. "You knew Miller was out of control. You knew Vance was cooking the books, but you liked the results. You liked the idea of a weapon that could do the dirty work without leaving any fingerprints. Well, I'm the fingerprint, and I'm not going away." Sterling held up a hand, silencing Maddox. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you have the leverage, Sarah? You think that encrypted file you sent to the secure server is your insurance policy. But let me ask you this. Who do you think manages that server? Who do you think decides what the Senate actually sees?" Sarah felt a cold chill wash over her, but she didn't let it show. She had known the system was compromised, but hearing the confidence in Sterling's voice was a different kind of pressure. The institution wasn't just grinding, it was closing ranks. It was a fortress, and she was on the outside, bleeding and alone. "The file isn't on a government server, Arthur," she said, lying with a conviction that would have fooled a polygraph. It was her extraordinary capability, the ability to process 1,000 variables in a second and find the one path to survival. "It's with a private entity, a person who knows exactly what to do if I don't check in every 12 hours. You can kill me. You can bury me. But the moment you do, the Vulture's source code goes live on every major news network in the world." It was a bluff. The file was actually on a thumb drive currently hidden in the lining of Elias's prosthetic leg back at Walter Reed, a detail only the two of them knew. But Sterling didn't know that. He saw the gray ghost, the woman who never made mistakes, the woman who was always 3 steps ahead, and he hesitated. That hesitation was the first crack in the fortress. "We can make this very difficult for you, Sarah," Sterling said, his voice losing its warmth. "We can make sure Major Holloway spends the rest of his life in a padded cell. We can make sure Elias Thorne never walks again without a guard. Is that what you want? Is your truth worth their lives?" The personal cost arrived then in its full, devastating weight. Sarah thought of Elias, his face pale and sweating as she bound his wound in the dark of the mine. She thought of Holloway, a man who was out of his depth but had tried to do the right thing when it mattered. They were the collateral damage of her conscience. She could save herself, but she couldn't save them without giving up the only thing that made her who she was. "They knew the risks," Sarah said, though the words felt like they were being carved out of her chest. "They chose to stand with me, and I won't dishonor that choice by folding now." Sterling watched her for a long time. The silence in the room was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. "Take her back to Belvoir," he finally said. "Keep her in isolation, no visitors, no phone calls. We'll see how long her loyalty lasts when she's staring at a wall for 24 hours a day." The drive back to the base was a blur of rain and gray pavement. Sarah sat in the back of the SUV, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She felt the difference in herself now. The woman who had entered the desert was gone. The woman who remained was something harder, something colder. She was a weapon that had been turned against its creators, and she knew that the only way to win was to be more patient than the machine trying to crush her. Sunday was the hardest. The isolation was a weapon in itself, a way to strip away a person's sense of time and identity. Sarah spent the hours doing push-ups on the cold floor, the sweat stinging the burns on her back. She counted the seconds, the minutes, the hours. She rehearsed the details of the mission over and over, making sure every name, every date, every coordinate was burned into her memory. She didn't pray. She didn't beg. She simply existed, a point of pure, unyielding light in a world of shadows. In the middle of the night, the small slot in the door slid open. A plastic tray was pushed through, but instead of the usual lukewarm mystery meat, there was a small, folded piece of paper tucked under the napkin. Sarah waited until the guard's footsteps had faded before she picked it up. The paper was rough, the handwriting a jagged, familiar scrawl. Asterisk, the ghost is still in the machine. Don't stop moving. M. Asterisk Miller, Specialist Miller, the young soldier she had saved in the very beginning, the one whose injury had been the catalyst for everything. He was still in the hospital, but he was a Miller, a name that meant something in the halls of the base. He had found a way to reach her. It was a small thing, a tiny spark of hope in the darkness, but it was enough. She wasn't alone. The people she had saved were watching her. The soldiers who actually did the work, the ones who bled while the generals argued over budgets, they knew the truth. The reckoning was coming, but it wouldn't be a public ceremony or a dramatic confession. It would be a slow, grinding process of attrition. It would be the sound of 1,000 small voices whispering the truth until the walls of the fortress began to crumble. Monday morning brought a new kind of visitor. This time, it wasn't a colonel or a general. It was a man in a rumpled suit with a cheap tie and a look of profound exhaustion. He carried a battered briefcase and a digital recorder. "I'm Special Agent David Aris," he said, sitting down at the small table in her room. "I'm with the Office of Special Counsel. I've been assigned to investigate your allegations regarding the Vulture Project." Sarah looked at him, her extraordinary capability scanning him for any sign of a tell. He wasn't like Henderson. He wasn't like Sterling. He looked like a man who had spent 20 years fighting a system that didn't want to be fixed. "Who sent you, Agent Aris?" she asked. "Nobody sent me, Colonel," he said, opening his briefcase. "I read the preliminary report from the Nevada Highway Patrol, the one that mentioned a high-energy fire and a missing Air Force vehicle. Then I read the OIG's summary, which said nothing happened. In my experience, when the OIG says nothing happened, it usually means something happened that they don't have a name for yet." He turned on the recorder. The small red light flickered, a tiny eye watching them in the gloom. "I'm going to be honest with you, Colonel Thorne. There are people in this building who have spent the last 48 hours trying to make sure I never walked through that door. They've threatened my pension, my clearance, and my car. But I've got 3 months until retirement, and I've never liked being told what to do. So why don't you tell me about the Vulture, and don't leave out the parts about the money?" Sarah looked at the recorder, then at the man. For the first time since the desert, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't rage or pain. It was the specific, quiet recognition of a fellow traveler. "Where do you want to start, Agent?" she asked. "Start at the beginning," Aris said. "Start with the day you realized the mission wasn't what they said it was." For the next 4 hours, Sarah spoke. She didn't use flowery language. She didn't appeal to his emotions. She gave him facts. She gave him the engineering specs of the plasma-actuated fans. She gave him the tail numbers of the Black Hueys. She gave him the names of the contractors she had seen in the mine. She gave him the specific dates of the meetings between Marcus Vance and the lobbyists from Aegis. Aris listened, his pen moving across his notepad with a steady, rhythmic scratch. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He simply absorbed the data, his face a mask of professional neutrality. But as the hours passed, Sarah saw his hand tighten on his pen. She saw the way his jaw set when she described the moment the laser had opened fire on her van. "They used it on you," Aris whispered, the first sign of emotion breaking through his veneer. "An experimental weapon on a United States officer." "They used it because they thought I was a target," Sarah said. "They had decided I was no longer part of the institution, and once you're outside the institution, you're just an obstacle." When she was finished, Aris sat back, his eyes fixed on the recorder. He looked older than he had when he walked in, the weight of the truth settling onto his shoulders. "This is going to be a bloodbath," he said quietly. "If even half of this is true, it's the biggest scandal in the history of the Department of Defense. It makes Tailhook look like a bake sale." "It is true," Sarah said, "and it's only the beginning. The Vulture isn't just one drone, it's a network. If you don't stop it now, they'll have the system fully integrated by the end of the year." Aris nodded. He packed his briefcase, his movements slow and deliberate. "I have what I need for the preliminary filing, but you need to understand something, Colonel. The moment I walk out of this room, the clock starts. They'll know I have your statement. They'll know I'm going to the IG. They're going to move fast to discredit you. They'll leak your personnel file. They'll talk about your instability after the valley. They'll try to make you look like a woman who's finally snapped under the pressure." "Let them try," Sarah said. "I've spent 15 years being a ghost. I'm quite comfortable with people not knowing who I am." Aris looked at her, a strange expression on his face. It was respect mixed with a profound sense of sadness. "You're a hell of a soldier, Thorne. I just wish the army deserved you." He walked out, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt different this time. It wasn't the sound of a prison door. It was the sound of a starting gun. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of quiet, institutional violence. Sarah watched the news on the small, grainy television in the corner of her room. They didn't mention her name, but they mentioned a personnel matter at Fort Belvoir. They mentioned an unfortunate accident during a training exercise in Nevada. They showed a photo of General Miller, his chest covered in medals, and spoke about his lifetime of service. The narrative was being set. The machinery was moving to bury her. But then something unexpected happened. A woman appeared on the screen. She was young, her face covered in a thin layer of hospital sweat, her hair a mess. She was sitting in a wheelchair at Walter Reed. It was a local news segment, a human interest story about a wounded warrior. "I'm here because of a woman I only know as the Colonel," the soldier said into the camera. It was Specialist Miller, not the one she had saved, but a different one, a woman who had been in the same unit. "She saved my brother's life. She saved my friend's life. And now I hear people are saying things about her. I hear they're trying to say she did something wrong. Well, I'm here to tell you that if she's wrong, then I don't want to be right. She's the only one who didn't lie to us. She's the only one who stayed." The segment was short, only 45 seconds, before the anchor cut away to a story about a weather system moving in from the coast. But it was enough. The crack in the fortress was widening. The soldiers were speaking. By Tuesday evening, the pressure in the room had changed again. The Tier 1 contractors were gone, replaced by regular Army MPs. They didn't look at her with suspicion anymore. They looked at her with a kind of hushed awe. They brought her a real meal, steak and mashed potatoes from the officers' mess. They brought her a fresh uniform, a set of BDUs with her name tape and her silver oak leaves. "The JAG is here, ma'am," one of the MPs said, his voice respectful. "They are in the briefing room. They are ready for you." Sarah stood up, the pain in her back now a dull, manageable ache. She dressed in the uniform, the weight of the fabric feeling like a shield. She looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look like a ghost. She looked like a lieutenant colonel of the United States Army. She looked like a woman who had walked through the fire and come out the other side with her head held high. She was led down the hall to a large, wood-paneled room. At the far end, a panel of 3 officers sat, 2 colonels and a brigadier general. They were all JAGs, their faces set in expressions of professional gravity. To the side sat Agent Aris and a woman Sarah didn't recognize, a sleek, sharp-featured civilian in a designer suit. "Colonel Thorne," the brigadier general said, gesturing to the seat in the center of the room. "I am General Holloway. No relation to the major, I assure you. This is an informal board of inquiry. We are here to review the evidence provided by the Office of Special Counsel and the Office of the Inspector General." Sarah sat. She felt the weight of the room, the weight of the institution, but she also felt something else. She felt the truth, sitting right there beside her, invisible and invincible. "General," she said, "we have spent the last 12 hours reviewing the data pad provided by Major Holloway," the general said, his voice dropping into a register of profound seriousness. "As well as the forensic evidence from the Vulture wreckage. We have also reviewed the financial records of the DARPA project annex. To say that we are disturbed by our findings would be a significant understatement." He looked at the other officers, then back at Sarah. "It appears that there was a coordinated effort to bypass congressional oversight and utilize autonomous weaponry in a manner that violates both the Geneva Convention and the Posse Comitatus Act. It also appears that several high-ranking officers, including the late General Miller, were involved in a scheme to embezzle funds from the project's black budget allocation." The room was silent. The air seemed to vibrate with the sheer scale of the admission. The institution was finally looking at itself in the mirror, and it didn't like what it saw. "However," the general continued, his voice hardening, "there is also the matter of your actions. You operated outside your chain of command. You utilized classified information for unauthorized purposes. You engaged in a combat action on United States soil without orders. These are serious infractions, Colonel. Infractions that cannot be ignored simply because you were right about the larger threat. Sarah didn't flinch. She had known this was coming. The institution would acknowledge the crime, but it would also punish the person who exposed it. It was the only way to maintain the illusion of order. I understand, General, Sarah said. I am prepared to face the consequences of my actions. I only ask that Major Holloway and Elias Thorne be cleared of any wrongdoing. They were following my orders. The Major is being reassigned to a post in Germany, the General said. His career will be stagnant, but he will remain in the service. As for Elias Thorne, he has been honorably discharged with a full medical pension. He is currently being moved to a private rehabilitation facility in Colorado. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, a physical sensation that made her eyes sting for a second. They were safe. She had done it. And what about me? She asked. The General looked at her for a long time. There was a look in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger and it wasn't respect. It was something more complicated. It was the look of a man who was looking at a ghost. The board has recommended a general court-martial, the General said. However, given the sensitive nature of the evidence and the potential for a public scandal that would be catastrophic to the Department of Defense, the Secretary of the Army has offered a different path. He leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. You will be allowed to retire, effective immediately. Your rank will be maintained, but you will be stripped of your security clearances. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement that is so restrictive you won't even be able to tell your dog what happened in Nevada. In return, the charges will be dropped and the Vulture project will be officially terminated. Sarah looked at him. It was the offer she had expected. A quiet exit, a way to make her disappear without the mess of a trial. It was a win for the institution and a win for her in a way. She would be free. She could go to Colorado, she could see Elias, but she also knew what was missing. And the others, she asked. Vance, Sterling, the men who authorized the laser. The General's face went cold. Mr. Vance has resigned for personal reasons. Mr. Sterling is no longer a part of the advisory board. The investigation is ongoing, but I think you know how these things work, Colonel. Some people are too big to fail. They will be quietly moved to the private sector, where they will continue to be successful and influential. That is the reality of the world we live in. The rage flared up in Sarah then, a hot, white light in the center of her chest. It was the rage of every soldier who had ever been betrayed by a man in a suit. It was the rage of the valley, of the mine, of the desert. So nothing changes, she said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. The names change, but the system stays the same. You just find a new drone and a new name for the project. We are doing what we can, Colonel, the General said, his voice rising. This is as much justice as you're going to get. Take the deal, go home, be grateful that you're not sitting in Leavenworth for the rest of your life. Sarah looked at the men on the panel. She looked at Aris, who was staring at his shoes. She looked at the JAG officers, who were already looking at their watches, ready for the next case, the next logistical problem. She felt the weight of her choice. She could sign the paper and walk away. She could be Sarah Thorne, the retired lieutenant colonel. She could have a life, or she could stay and fight a system that was designed to win. She thought of the gray ghost. She thought of the woman who had spent her life in the shadows, doing the work that nobody else would do. She thought of the soldiers who had looked at her with awe, the ones who believed that she was different. She stood up. She didn't say a word. She walked to the table, picked up the pen, and looked at the non-disclosure agreement. It was 20 pages of legal jargon, a cage made of ink and paper. She didn't sign it. She laid the pen back down on the table, her eyes fixed on the General. I'll see you at the court-martial, General, she said. The room went silent. The Brigadier General looked at her in disbelief. Aris looked up, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. Thorne, don't be a fool, the General hissed. You can't win this. I don't need to win, Sarah said, her voice a clear, ringing bell that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the building. I just need to make sure that when the truth finally comes out, it's not because you allowed it. It's because I forced it. She turned and walked out of the room, her boots clicking on the floor with a steady, defiant rhythm. She walked through the hall, past the MPs, past the cameras, past the fortress of the institution. She was still a prisoner. She was still under guard. She was facing a trial that would likely end her life as she knew it. But as she walked back to her small, windowless room, Sarah Thorne felt a sense of power she had never known before. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a witness. And for the first time in 15 years, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The sun was setting over the Potomac, the light casting long, orange shadows across the base. Sarah sat by her window, watching the planes take off from Reagan National across the river. She felt the weight of the coming battle, the weight of the personal cost that was only just beginning to be paid. She knew what was coming. They would tear her apart. They would find every mistake she had ever made, every doubt she had ever had, and they would use them to build a cage for her. They would try to make her disappear. But as she sat in the dark, Sarah Thorne felt the first flicker of hope, a small, specific thing that was as real as the blood in her veins. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to stop until the whole world heard it. The door to her room opened. It wasn't an MP. It was Commander Voss, the doctor. She carried a small, wrapped package. "The board is over," Voss said, her voice a whisper. "I heard what you did." "I did what I had to do," Sarah said. Voss handed her the package. "This was delivered to the medical wing. It's for you. They tried to intercept it, but I told them it was specialized dressing for your burns." Sarah opened the package. Inside was a small, silver coin, a challenge coin. On one side was the crest of the Gray Ghost unit. On the other, a single word was engraved in the metal. Asterisk always. Asterisk. Sarah held the coin in her hand, the metal cold and heavy against her skin. She looked at Voss, and for the first time in years, she smiled. It was a small, brief thing, but it was real. "Thank you, Commander," Sarah said. "Don't thank me," Voss said. "Just don't let them win." She walked out, the door locking behind her. Sarah sat on her bed, the coin pressed against her palm. She thought of Elias, of Holloway, of the soldiers who were still out there doing the work in the dark. She wasn't alone. She was the tip of a spear that was much larger than she had realized. The reckoning was coming, and Sarah Thorne was ready. She lay back on the thin mattress, her eyes closed. She thought of the desert, of the blue laser, of the sound of the vulture's sigh. She thought of the cost of being right and the price of being true. She was a soldier. She was a leader. She was a woman who had found her voice in the middle of a storm. And as the night settled over Fort Belvoir, Sarah Thorne fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the coin still clutched in her hand. The battle was only just beginning, and the true cost had yet to be paid. But in the quiet of the room, for the first time in a long time, the Gray Ghost was at peace. She woke the next morning to the sound of a bugle playing revelry in the distance. The sound was clear and sharp in the morning air, a reminder of the life she had chosen and the world she was still a part of. She stood up and walked to the window, the light of the new day warming her face. She looked at the Potomac, the water shimmering in the sun. She looked at the Pentagon, the massive, five-sided fortress that held the secrets of her life. She knew that today would be the day the formal charges were filed. Today would be the day the public narrative began to shift. Today would be the day the institution truly began to try to erase her. But as she stood in the light, Sarah Thorne knew that they would fail. Because you can't erase a ghost that has decided to become a person. You can't silence a voice that has decided to speak. And you can't defeat a soldier who has nothing left to lose but her honor. She turned from the window and began her morning routine, the push-ups, the sit-ups, the meticulous cleaning of her uniform. She was a soldier of the United States Army, and she was going to act like one until the very end. The knock came at 0800. "Colonel Thorne, you're wanted in the Staff Judge Advocate's office. It's time." Sarah picked up her cover, placed it perfectly on her head, and checked herself in the mirror one last time. Her eyes were clear, her posture was perfect, and her heart was steady. "I'm ready," she said. She walked out of the room, the MPs falling in behind her. She walked through the halls of the base, the sun streaming through the windows, the sound of her boots a steady, rhythmic cadence. The reckoning had begun, and Sarah Thorne was leading the way. The starch in Sarah's Army service uniform felt like a second skin, a stiff, dark blue shell that held her together when the rest of the world felt like it was dissolving into a haze of legal proceedings and character assassination. She stood in front of the small, fogged mirror in the women's latrine of the JAG courthouse at Fort Myer, Virginia. It was 0745 on a Tuesday, the air smelling of floor wax and the faint, sweet scent of the cherry blossoms beginning to bloom outside on the banks of the Potomac. Her silver oak leaves caught the harsh, fluorescent light, gleaming with a cold, clinical brightness. She had spent 2 hours the night before using a ruler to ensure her ribbons. The bronze star with valor, the meritorious service medal, the rows of small, colorful bars that represented 15 years of a life lived in the shadows. were perfectly aligned to within a 16th of an inch. She didn't do it for the board of officers who would decide her fate. She did it because, in a world where she was being stripped of her identity, the geometry of the uniform was the only thing she could still control. The court-martial of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thorne was not the grand, public spectacle the media had predicted. There were no cameras allowed inside the wood-paneled courtroom, no gallery filled with protesters or supporters. The institution had ensured that the reckoning would happen in a vacuum, a quiet, controlled demolition of a career. The room was small, the air thick with the smell of old paper, and the low, mechanical hum of a portable air purifier that someone had tucked into a corner to combat the dampness of the Virginia spring. At the front of the room sat the members, the military version of a jury, comprising 5 colonels and a brigadier general, all men and women who had spent their lives climbing the same ladder Sarah was currently accused of sawing through. They didn't look at her with hatred. They looked at her with a profound, uncomfortable curiosity, the way one might look at a high-performance engine that had suddenly and inexplicably exploded. Major Henderson, the prosecutor who had been hand-picked by the Pentagon for his reputation as a closer, opened the proceedings by laying out a timeline that turned Sarah's heroism into a list of crimes. He spoke of unauthorized kinetic actions, the theft of government property, and the reckless endangerment of civilian contractors. He painted a picture of a woman who had finally succumbed to the lone wolf mythology of the special operations community. A woman who believed she was above the law because she had spent so much time operating in places where the law didn't exist. Sarah watched him, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her extraordinary capability dialed into the high-frequency vibrations of the room. She watched the way Henderson's left eyelid flickered when he mentioned the Vulture drone, a tell that he was lying about the machine's capabilities. She watched the way the brigadier general on the board shifted his weight every time the embezzlement of funds was mentioned. They weren't trying to find the truth. They were trying to find a version of the truth that the public could swallow. The first witness was Major Holloway. He walked to the stand with a limp that he tried to hide, his face pale and drawn. He looked at Sarah for a fraction of a second, and in that look she saw everything: the fear of the psychiatric ward, the pressure he'd been under to testify against her, and the flickering ember of the man who had stood beside her in the desert. Henderson spent an hour trying to lead him, trying to get Holloway to say that Sarah had coerced him, that she had been mentally unstable during the engagement in Nevada. "Major Holloway," Henderson said, leaning against the witness stand, his voice smooth and paternal. "Isn't it true that Colonel Thorne ignored direct orders from General Miller? Isn't it true that she took control of the mission without any legal authority?" Holloway sat in silence for a long time. The sound of a lawnmower outside on the base grounds drifted through the window, a mundane, suburban sound that felt absurd in the context of the room. He looked at the general on the board, then he looked at his own hands. "She didn't take control, sir," Holloway said, his voice cracking slightly before he found his resonance. "She was the only one who had control. General Miller was. He was compromised. The system was compromised. If Colonel Thorne hadn't done what she did, that drone would have continued to target Americans. I wouldn't be sitting here. Neither would the civilian contractors. She didn't ignore orders. She fulfilled the only order that matters, the oath to protect the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic." A ripple of unease went through the board. Henderson's face hardened, his jaw set in a line of frustration. He had expected Holloway to break, to choose his career over his conscience. But the institution had forgotten that loyalty isn't built in briefings. It's built in the dirt and the heat, in the shared knowledge of what it feels like to be hunted. The trial ground on for 3 days. Each hour cost Sarah something: a piece of her reputation, a fragment of her future, the exhaustion of maintaining her mask while being dissected in public. On the 3rd afternoon, Agent David Arris was called to the stand. He didn't wear a uniform. He wore the same rumpled suit from their first meeting, looking like a man who had slept in his car. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been through a war of its own. "Agent Arris," Sarah's defense counsel, a sharp-eyed captain named Miller who had taken the case against the advice of every mentor he had, stood up. "In your capacity with the Office of Special Counsel, did you uncover any evidence that supports Colonel Thorne's claim regarding the Vulture project?" Arris didn't look at Henderson. He looked at the board of officers. "I didn't just find evidence. I found the receipts. I spent the last 72 hours in a secure digital forensics lab at Quantico. We managed to bypass the encryption on the server that Marcus Vance tried to wipe. We found the source code for the Vulture's targeting algorithm. It wasn't programmed for combat zones. It was programmed for domestic surveillance and neutralization. And we found the offshore accounts. General Miller wasn't just a part of the project. He was a shareholder in the company that built the sensors. The silence in the courtroom was so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. This was the moment the gray ghost had been waiting for, the moment the shadows were dragged into the light. But there was no triumph in it for Sarah. There was only the heavy, sickening weight of the cost. The institution she had served for 15 years had been rotting from the inside, and she had been the one to cut out the tumor. Henderson tried to object, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. General, this is highly classified material that has not been cleared for this hearing. This agent is in violation of— Sit down, Major, the Brigadier General said. He wasn't looking at Henderson, he was looking at Sarah. Agent Aris, do you have these documents with you? I have the decrypted files on a secure drive, sir, Aris said, along with the names of the 14 other officers who were on the payroll. The board went into a closed session that lasted for 6 hours. Sarah was taken back to a small holding room where she sat in the dark, watching the headlights of the cars on the George Washington Parkway. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. She just existed in the stillness, her mind processing the variables of what would happen next. She knew the institution. She knew that even with this evidence, they couldn't let her go entirely. They had to maintain the illusion that the chain of command was sacred, even when it was broken. At 2200 hours, the board reconvened. The room felt different now, colder, more professional. The curiosity was gone, replaced by a grim, collective realization that the house was on fire. The Brigadier General stood up, a single sheet of paper in his hand. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thorne, this board has reached a verdict. On the charges of theft of government property and unauthorized kinetic action, we find you not guilty. On the charge of being AWOL from your post at the Pentagon, we find you guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer for the unauthorized release of classified data, we find you guilty. Sarah stood perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the general's head. She didn't flinch. She had expected this. A split verdict. A way for the army to acknowledge her truth while still punishing her for how she told it. The sentence of this board, the general continued, his voice heavy, is as follows. You are to be reprimanded and stripped of your command. You are ordered to forfeit all pay and allowances for a period of 6 months. And given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, you are hereby granted a general discharge under honorable conditions, effective immediately. It was over. The career was dead, but the honor remained. Sarah Thorne was no longer a lieutenant colonel. She was no longer the gray ghost. She was a civilian with a map of burns on her back and a story that she could never tell. The room cleared quickly. Henderson left without looking at her, his briefcase snapping shut with a sound of finality. Aris stayed for a moment, nodding to her from the back of the room before disappearing into the night. Captain Miller, the young lawyer, shook her hand, his palms sweaty and his eyes wide with the realization of what they had just done. You won, Colonel, he whispered. No, Miller, Sarah said, her voice quiet and tired. Nobody wins in a room like this. She walked out of the courthouse alone. The night air was cool, the smell of the river strong. She walked across the parking lot toward the gate, her boots hitting the pavement with a sound that felt lighter than it had in years. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a phone. She just had the uniform on her back and the silver coin in her pocket. At the gate, a lone MP stood under the yellow glow of the street lamp. He was young, maybe 20 years old, his face smooth and unlined. As Sarah approached, he snapped to attention and delivered a salute that was so sharp, so perfect, it felt like a salute to everything she had lost. Sarah stopped. She looked at him, and for the first time since the mine in Nevada, she felt a lump in her throat. She returned the salute, her hand steady, her eyes meeting his. Thank you, Specialist, she said. Good luck, ma'am, the boy said. We heard, everyone heard. Sarah walked through the gate and out into the city. She spent the next 2 days in a cheap motel in Arlington, sleeping for 12 hours at a time, her body finally allowing itself to collapse. She traded her uniform for a pair of jeans and a gray hoodie she bought at a CVS. She looked at the blue and gold ribbons in the trash can, the fabric that had defined her life, and she felt nothing but a profound, hollow relief. She was a ghost who had finally been exorcised. On Thursday morning, she took a bus to the airport and used the last of her cash to buy a ticket to Colorado Springs. The rehabilitation facility was tucked into the foothills of the Rockies, a place of pine trees and granite peaks that looked like they had been carved out of the sky. It smelled of wood smoke and crisp, thin air. Sarah walked up the gravel path, her legs feeling heavy and slow. She found him on a terrace overlooking a valley, sitting in a wheelchair with a blanket over his legs. Elias Thorne looked older, his face thinner, but the eyes were the same, sharp, clear, and utterly unafraid. He didn't say anything as she approached. He just watched her the way a tracker watches the horizon. She sat down in the wooden chair beside him, the silence between them as comfortable as an old coat. "You look like hell," Elias finally said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You're not exactly a pin-up model yourself, Elias," Sarah replied. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The cost was all around them, in the way Elias's hand shook as he reached for a glass of water, in the way Sarah couldn't sit back against the chair without the burns on her back throbbing, in the knowledge that they were both outsiders now, men and women without a country to serve. "They killed the project," Sarah said. "Officially anyway. Vance is in private consulting. Sterling is retired. Holloway is in Germany. Eris is probably looking for a new job." "And you?" Elias asked. "I'm a civilian, general discharge, no pension, no clearance." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the peaks. "Good. You were always too big for that uniform, Sarah. It was like watching a tiger try to live in a birdcage." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but his touch was warm, a solid, human connection that grounded her in a way the military never could. They were the only two people in the world who knew the truth of what had happened in that mine. They were the keepers of the secret, the silent architects of a victory that would never be celebrated. "What now?" Elias asked. Sarah looked out at the valley. She thought of the gray ghost, the woman who had spent 15 years being a tool for people who didn't deserve her. She thought of the silence of the desert, the way the world looked when you weren't looking at it through a thermal scope. "I bought a truck," she said. "An old Ford, needs a new transmission. I'm going to drive north, to Montana. My grandfather had a cabin near the Bitterroot, probably half-rotten by now." "Montana," Elias said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Lots of space, lots of silence." "I've had enough of the silence that hides things, Elias," Sarah said. "I want the silence that just is." She stayed with him for a week, helping him with his physical therapy, walking beside him as he learned to use a prosthetic leg that hummed with the same frequency as the vulture sensors. They didn't talk about the mission. They talked about the birds they saw in the trees, the taste of the mountain water, the way the light changed as the day progressed. They were learning how to be people again, one breath at a time. When it was time for her to leave, Elias stood at the door of the facility, leaning on a cane. He looked like a man who had been broken and put back together with iron and grit. "Don't get lost up there, Sarah," he said. "I'm not the one who gets lost, Elias," she said. "I'm the one who finds things." She drove the Ford F-150 out of Colorado and into the vast, open heart of the American West. The truck was loud and smelled of oil and old upholstery, a mechanical rhythm that replaced the hum of the drone and the roar of the striker. She drove through Wyoming, past the vast, empty plains and the jagged teeth of the Tetons. She didn't look at the news. She didn't look at her phone. She just watched the road, her eyes scanning the horizon for the variables she had spent her life hunting. She reached the Bitterroot Valley on a Tuesday afternoon, just as a light rain began to fall. The cabin was exactly as she remembered it, a small, sagging structure of silver-gray cedar, tucked into a grove of hemlocks near a rushing stream. It was cold and smelled of damp earth and old needles, a place that didn't care about rank or missions or the preservation of an institution. Sarah spent the first month doing the work. She replaced the rotted floorboards, her hands becoming calloused and stained with wood sealer. She cleared the brush from the trail, the physical labor a form of meditation that slowly began to quiet the noise in her head. She didn't think about the Pentagon. She didn't think about Marcus Vance. She thought about the weight of the hammer in her hand, the way the wood yielded to the saw, the smell of the pine resin on her skin. In the evenings, she sat on the small porch, watching the stars come out. The sky in Montana was a deep, velvet black, untainted by the lights of the city or the infrared glow of a battlefield. She looked up at the constellations, Orion, the Great Bear, the North Star, and felt the immense, terrifying scale of the universe. For 15 years, she had been a point on a map, a set of coordinates in a digital world. Now she was just a woman on a porch, a tiny, insignificant part of a world that was too big to be controlled. The personal cost was still there, of course. Sometimes in the middle of the night she would wake up in a cold sweat, her hands reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Sometimes she would see a hawk circling in the sky and her heart would skip a beat, her mind automatically calculating the distance and the speed, looking for the tell of a camera lens. She knew she would never be normal. She would always be the gray ghost, the woman who saw too much and felt too much. But she was learning to live with the ghost, to let it sit in the corner of the room instead of letting it run her life. One afternoon in late May, a black SUV drove up the dirt road and stopped at the edge of the clearing. Sarah was on the roof, replacing a cedar shingle. She didn't panic. She didn't reach for a weapon. She just sat back on her heels and watched as a man stepped out of the car. It was Agent Aris. He looked better than he had at the trial. He was wearing a flannel shirt and khakis, and he carried a cardboard box. Sarah climbed down the ladder, her movements fluid and controlled. "You're a long way from D.C., David." "The OSC gave me a month of mandatory leave," Aris said, leaning against the hood of the SUV. "They said I was too close to the investigation. I decided to take a road trip, see the parts of the country I've been trying to protect for 20 years. He handed her the box. "I found this in the evidence locker at Belvoir. It wasn't on the official inventory. I thought you might want it back." Sarah opened the box. Inside was her grandfather's old compass, the brass tarnished, the glass cracked from the fall in the mine. She picked it up, the weight of it familiar and grounding. "Thank you," she said. "Vance is being indicted," Aris said, his voice dropping into a professional register. "The Senate committee got the decrypted files. They couldn't ignore it once the media started asking questions about the missing funds. There are going to be more arrests, a lot more." Sarah looked at the compass. "Does it matter? They'll just find a new way to do the same thing. The institution always survives, David." "Maybe," Aris said. "But for once it's surviving on our terms, because you didn't take the deal, because you made them look at it." He looked around the clearing, his eyes lingering on the cabin and the stream. "It's quiet here." "That's the idea," Sarah said. They stood in the silence for a moment, two people who had seen the worst of the system and had somehow come out the other side. They were survivors of a war that had no front line, a conflict of conscience that left scars no one could see. "I should go," Aris said. "I've got another 400 miles to go before dark." "Take care of yourself, David," Sarah said. "You too, Sarah." He got back in the SUV and drove away, the dust from the road hanging in the air like a fading memory. Sarah watched until the car was out of sight, then she walked back to the cabin. She placed the compass on the small wooden table by the window, right next to the silver challenge coin. The light was fading, the shadows stretching long and jagged across the floor. Sarah sat in her chair, the smell of the damp earth coming through the screen door. She felt the weight of her life, the cost of her choices, the sheer, exhausting reality of being herself. But she also felt something else, a sense of peace that wasn't a summary of events, but the event itself. She wasn't waiting for a mission. She wasn't waiting for an order. She was just waiting for the stars. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, the air in the cabin cold enough to see her breath. She made a pot of coffee and sat on the porch, watching the mist rise off the stream. She had a list of things to do. The roof still leaked near the chimney, and she needed to haul in more firewood for the winter. But for the first time in her life, the list didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. She thought of the soldiers she had known, the men and women who were still out there, living in the shadows. She thought of Specialist Miller, who was probably back at Belvoir, telling stories about the gray ghost to a new crop of recruits. She thought of Elias, who was learning to walk again in the thin air of Colorado. They were the ones who mattered. Not the generals, not the lobbyists, not the people in the suits. The ones who stayed when staying cost them everything. Sarah stood up and walked down to the stream. The water was clear and ice-cold, tumbling over the stones with a sound like broken glass. She knelt down and splashed the water on her face, the shock of the cold making her skin tingle. She looked at her reflection in the moving water, the sunken eyes, the sharp cheekbones, the gray in her hair. She looked like a woman who had survived a war, but she also looked like a woman who was ready for whatever came next. She spent the rest of the day working on the roof. The physical labor was hard, her muscles aching and her back screaming as the sun beat down on her. But she didn't stop. She moved with the same quiet competence she had used to dismantle the vulture, her hands precise, her focus absolute. She was building something real, something that would last. As the sun began to set, she finished the last row of shingles. She sat on the peak of the roof, looking out over the valley. The world was green and gold, the mountains purple in the distance. It was a beautiful place, a place that didn't need a name or a purpose to be true. She thought of the very first line of her file, the one that had defined her for 15 years. Asterisk subject possesses an extraordinary capability for tactical observation and the neutralization of complex threats. Asterisk she realized now that they had been wrong. That wasn't her capability. Her capability was the ability to see the truth when everyone else was looking at the narrative. Her capability was the strength to hold on to her honor when the world was trying to trade it for safety. She climbed down the ladder and walked into the cabin. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat in the dark, watching the way the moonlight filtered through the trees. She felt the presence of the ghost in the room, the woman she used to be, and she didn't try to push it away. She welcomed it. It was part of the map. It was how she had found her way home. She reached out and picked up the compass. She didn't need it to find north. She knew exactly where she was. She turned the brass casing in her hand, feeling the cold, smooth metal against her palm. She thought of her grandfather, the man who had given it to her, and the long, winding road that had brought it back to this room. She put the compass down and walked to the door. She looked out at the night, the air smelling of pine and rain and the vast, unwritten future. She wasn't a weapon anymore. She wasn't a ghost. She was just Sarah Thorne, and for the first time in her life, that was more than enough. The silence of the mountains was not the silence of the desert. It was not the silence of the interrogation room or the courtroom. It was the silence of a world that was simply existing, a world that didn't need to be explained or justified or controlled. Sarah breathed in the cold night air, her chest expanding, her heart beating with a steady, rhythmic pulse. She felt the weight of her life, the cost of her truth, and the quiet, enduring hope that had survived it all. She turned and walked back into the cabin, closing the door behind her. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was not the sound of a prison. It was the sound of a woman who had finally found a place where she didn't have to watch the door. She lay down on the bed, her eyes closing as the sound of the stream drifted through the window. She didn't dream of the valley. She didn't dream of the drone. She dreamed of the mountains, of the light on the water, of the way the world looked when the shadows were finally gone. In the quiet of the Bitterroot, the gray ghost had finally found a way to become real. The morning brought a fresh dusting of snow on the peaks, the air crisp and clean. Sarah walked out onto the porch, a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked at the trail she had cleared, the path that led away from the cabin and into the heart of the woods. She knew that the world was still a dangerous place. She knew that there were still people like Marcus Vance and Arthur Sterling, people who believed that the mission was more important than the truth. She knew that she might one day be called back into the shadows, that the institution might one day need the woman it had discarded. But as she stood on the porch, Sarah Thorne knew that she would be ready, not because she had the uniform, but because she had the truth. She watched a hawk circle in the sky, its wings wide and steady against the blue. It wasn't a drone. It wasn't a sensor. It was just a bird hunting in the only way it knew how. Sarah watched it until it disappeared over the ridge, then she turned and went back to work. The hammer felt heavy in her hand, the wood solid and real. She drove the first nail into the new porch railing, the sound echoing through the clearing like a heartbeat. She was building something. She was staying. The world was big and complicated and broken, but here in this small, quiet corner of it, things were exactly what they seemed to be. Sarah Thorne took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and she smiled. The cost had been everything she had, but the price was worth the life she finally owned.